Chapter 41. His Child. Chapter text Severus, really. Severus started, pointing his wand instinctively at the intruder, even whilst knowing good and well who it was. He met Albus' gaze unflinchingly. It had to be done. Albus eyed Quirrell's body on the ground with a furrowed brow. "Don't tell me you weren't aware of who he was," said Severus, his heart still thumping rapidly. Albus looked up. "Oh, I was aware. I had simply hoped to observe him for a while longer, to glean Voldemort's possible intentions beyond gaining immortality through the stone. Considering that he does not quite need it, Severus was not quite sure of what Albus was implying, but a strange chill ran up his spine. He ignored it for the moment. "Did you purposefully disregard the threat he posed to Harry?" he asked, the tone of his voice carefully controlled. It would not do for his voice to tremble. Dumbledore furrowed his brow. "I was keeping a very close eye on both of them. I would not have allowed any harm to come to Harry. You and I have a very different definition of harm," Severus snarled, clenching his fist around his wand. Harry spoke of pain in his scar, his curse scar, whenever he was in the man's presence. Do not try to tell me that was in any way coincidental. Dumbledore flinched, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to raise alarm bells. Enough for Severus to point his wand directly at Albus' face. "If you have plans for Harry that I am not privy to, plans beyond him surviving to adulthood intact, you had best inform me now." His hand shook, not only in his fury, but in his raw, visceral fear. He would not presume to think he would be able to overpower Albus if their goals diverged. And his goals now revolved around Harry, and Harry alone. He could not assume Albus would claim the same. "If your intentions are not solely for Harry's benefit, I will end you." Albus gazed back at him, infuriatingly calm. "Lower your wand, Severus, and perhaps we can relocate to my office for a conversation." The headmaster waved his wand, vanishing Quirrell's body to parts unknown, to the fiery pits of hell, for all Severus cared. After a long, fraught pause, Severus sheathed his wand and abruptly strode towards Albus' office. He marched past the gargoyle statues ahead of Albus, which had opened when they detected the presence of the headmaster, barreled his way through the door, and stood stiffly with his back against the wall as Albus settled into his seat behind the desk. "Please sit down." After what felt like an endless moment, Severus did, his back ramrod straight, and jaw clenched so tightly it would likely ache come morning. He stared at Albus, who he could almost believe was unruffled, if not for the very faint twitching of his eyelids that he had only picked up on after years spent in the man's presence. Severus stared, waiting for Albus to speak, knowing instinctively that what the man had to say might be the very last thing he wanted to hear. "Allow me to tell you a story about a young Tom Riddle and his quest for immortality." "That's a ridiculous story," Anthony declared, waving around a throw pillow for emphasis. Stephen shrugged from where he was seated cross-legged on his bed, braiding Sue's hair from where she was sitting on the floor. It was kind of unfair that the girls were allowed in their dorm, but the boys weren't afforded the same privilege. Harry was just thankful that he hadn't been the one to make the mistake of trying. Anthony had gone dashing up the stairs to drag Padma off to the first Gobstones Club meeting after growing impatient waiting for her to get ready, and the stairs had turned into a stone slide that landed him flat on his back at the foot of it, amidst laughter and teasing from the older students, many of whom had learned the hard way. "It's still true," said Stephen. "I can make myself look however I want, so who's to say I can't impersonate my own father at his job?" He let go of Sue's hair and got to his feet, his hair shortening and lightening to a grey-streaked middling brown, legs lengthening and shoulders broadening, until he looked vaguely like an older version of himself, albeit with lighter skin, thinner, straighter hair, blue eyes instead of his dark brown, and a rounder jaw with stubble on his chin. "But doesn't the ministry have, like, security?" Anthony asked, rolling onto his back with his head dangling off the edge of the bed. "Can't they tell if it's not really him? Not in the Department of Magical Games and Sports," said Stephen, returning to his previous appearance and grabbing onto Sue's hair to complete the intricate braid. "They can't be asked with proper security protocols, according to Dad. It would be harder in other departments, like law enforcement." "Don't pull so hard," Sue protested, wincing. "I honestly don't know why I let you talk me into this, because you never do anything with your hair, and it's so long and perfect for braiding." She scowled, Why don't you grow your own hair and do it yourself? Why do you think I know how to do this? Stephen replied. But it's more fun doing it for someone else. He glanced over at Harry, who was engrossed in reading the recipe of a particularly gruesome potion from a book he'd nicked from the restricted section. You're next. It was Harry's turn to scowl. Try and I'll hex you. Stephen rolled his eyes. Fine, live your life with a rat's nest on your head. Harry snorted. He'd accepted that as his lot in life, the third time Petunia had shorn it off, only for it to grow back the next day even thicker and messier than it had been before. His hair was going nowhere. You could do mine, Anthony piped up. He stood up on his bed and attempted a backflip, landing face first onto a mess of blankets. You've got to grow it longer, said Stephen, eyeing Anthony's hair. He completed Sue's braid with a flourish and thrust a mirror in her face. She stared at herself for several moments, turning her head this way and that. You like it, don't pretend you don't, Stephen said, grinning. Sue rolled her eyes, but a smile pulled at her lips. Oh, are we a salon now? Harry glanced over to the door, through which Terry and Michael had just entered. We are whatever we want to be at any given time. Stephen flicked some imaginary dust off his sleeve. Terry shrugged, dumping his bag at the foot of his bed and kicking off his shoes. Fair enough. Harry needs a salon. Anthony felt the need to interject, hopping onto Harry's bed and scrubbing a hand over his hair. You prat! Harry slapped his hands away, and somehow they managed to get themselves into a wrestling match that ended with Anthony pinned on his back with his arms over his head, Terry slow clapping, and Sue nearly crying from laughter. You're both such idiots, she gasped, clutching her stomach. Harry glanced back at her with a smirk. I won, though. You're strong for a small bloke, Anthony said breathlessly, squirming in his pinned position. Harry released him, though not without a shove on the shoulder for calling him small. Sue soon left for her dormitory, and Harry and his roommates prepared for bed, the chatter fading into yawns. Harry lay back in his bed and put on his charmed earplugs, still marveling at the way they effectively blocked out all sound. Moments away from sleep, a strange chill ran up Harry's spine, and a brief yet sharp pain shot through his scar. Severus sat frozen in his seat, his blood like ice in his veins, and his heart rate oddly slow. This is the reason you allowed Quirrell to remain in the castle, Severus said slowly, his mouth moving of its own accord. To study him in your attempt to track down the Horcruxes. Albus eyed him for a moment before inclining his head. I was confident that his aim was to steal the Philosopher's Stone, not to harm any students, not even Harry, and I was tracking him carefully all the same. Do you intend for Harry to die? Severus hadn't planned to ask the question outright until it emerged, unbidden, and he then realized it was the only answer that truly mattered. Albus closed his eyes. No. Severus narrowed his eyes. No. What is your intention, then? The boy, my child, contains a living remnant of the Dark Lord's soul entangled within his own, and while he lives, it does as well. He closed his eyes, then opened them again to pierce his gaze into Albus, lowering his mental defenses so that Albus would see, so that Albus would know how very little the survival of the Dark Lord mattered when held up against the life of Harry. To his credit, Albus did not avert his gaze. Had my intention been to allow Harry to die for this, I would not have placed him in the care of a man such as yourself, who I knew without a moment of doubt would stop at nothing to ensure his survival. Do you have a solution, then? I am looking. I have been looking since I found Harry in early summer. Why not start your looking immediately upon the Dark Lord's defeat? Severus bit out. I did not know, Severus, not until I met the boy. Severus suppressed a snarl. You mean to tell me this is unprecedented? Albus cut in sharply. I had not conceived that it was even possible for a shard of Voldemort's soul to latch onto another living being, yet when I met Harry, I sensed a presence, a darkness beyond that of his suffering. You sensed a presence, Severus said, raising a skeptical eyebrow. And that is your only indication of my suspicions were confirmed when Harry's scar pained him in Quirrell's presence. Albus set his palms flat on the desk. There is precious little documentation of individuals creating Horcruxes, and there exists no manual of how to accomplish such a feat. Yet, I have been studying this phenomenon for some time, and upon meeting Harry, I sought out the company of an old friend, who, after some persuasion, provided me with the confirmation I needed that Tom Riddle had indeed endeavored to create multiple Horcruxes. Albus paused to pull out a ring of tarnished gold, adorned with a black stone that was cracked cleanly down the middle. And this was one of them. Severus leaned forward, staring. "How did you destroy it?" "With a blade coated in basilisk venom," Albus said simply. Severus jerked backwards in his seat. "How in Merlin's name did you manage to procure such an item?" Albus smiled. "Ah, that is a story for another day, though I will say it involved an unexpected foray through rusted pipes and a most spectacular display of cleverness on Fawkes' part." Severus was briefly at a loss for words, but he brushed off his incredulity for the moment. "Do you know of any other methods," he asked, "to destroy the Horcruxes?" "Fiendfire." Albus tilted his head. "Scarcely a reliable alternative." Severus was fortunate enough to have never witnessed the use of fiendfire in person, though rumors had traveled amongst the Death Eaters that the Dark Lord had used it on several of his followers whom he had deemed unfaithful. He forced back a shudder. "Precisely. When were you intending to inform me of this?" he snapped, the harshness of his tone mainly a result of his attempt to conceal his unease. "My intention was to inform you upon discovering a solution," said Albus. He caught Severus' eye. "I did not want to burden you unnecessarily." Severus did not bother to point out the fallacy of such a strategy, disregarding the fact that, as Harry's guardian, burdening himself with any and all issues that pertained to the child was precisely Severus' job. It could have only helped for him to assist in the research, to contribute his own expertise in the area of dark magic. "What are your leads?" he asked instead. Albus' eyes narrowed, and he fingered the rusted ring on his desk. Severus glanced at it, noticing for the first time that amid the long crack in the stone was a triangular engraving. It looked oddly familiar. Oh, what the bloody hell did that matter? Severus took several long breaths, yet he could not seem to quell the rage, the utter fear that he would lose Harry to this, perhaps not by Albus' hand, but by the Dark Lord's soul. It was easier to focus on the smaller questions, on minor grievances, rather than fully contemplate what this could mean. "You allowed Quirrell to continue teaching Harry's classes whilst knowing it caused him pain. I imagined Harry would bring it to your attention, and you would utilize your authority as his guardian to remove him from the class. I was certain you would not appreciate my interference in such matters." Severus leaned back, the sharp edge of the backrest pressing into his nape. It only compelled him to dig his skin in further, the ache of it feeling oddly satisfying. "I did remove him as such, though it is rather a moot point now." The image of Quirrell's lifeless body on the ground flashed across his mind. He did not need to know, nor did he care, precisely where Albus had banished his body. Yet it took Harry until this week to inform me, after the boy had nearly passed out from the pain. As frustrated as Severus had been at the boy's reticence, he knew all too well how much it took out of Harry to seek help from his guardian upon spending years in the care of worthless individuals who had done everything in their power to teach Harry that asking for help would only lead to more pain. A sudden resurgence of anger rose in his chest. "If we are speaking of interference, was that your justification for refusing to ascertain with your own two eyes that Harry was not being egregiously abused by the people you left him in the care of?" Albus closed his eyes. "I had thought my interference would only render bad feelings, or worse, I should say, towards the wizarding world and Harry by extension." He paused. "Yet it seems that their feelings towards Harry had soured regardless. What you should have done," Severus spat, "is observed from afar, and just one day, would have given you all the information you needed. You could have delegated the task to someone other than a half-senile squib." Albus' face contorted briefly, the color in his eyes dulling. "I have handled few situations more negligibly than that of Harry's." At least the man was honest, which was the most that could be said, and Severus curled his lip at the futility of the man's evident regret. Yet what was past, and could not be changed, unlike the matter at hand. "If your proposed solution involves Harry being harmed in any way," Severus said steadily, "I will not hesitate to make good on my threat to flee the wizarding world with him." Albus inclined his head. "In this, your intentions and mine do coincide. I am doing, and will continue to do my utmost to ensure Harry's survival and well-being." Severus shifted forward. "And I will, You will remain at Harry's side, out of harm's way, until such a time comes that you must protect him, with your life if need be," Albus interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. "Of course I will protect him," Severus hissed, "and not for any reason as trivial as the vow I made to you all those years ago." "I never had any doubt," said Albus. "You love him." Severus did not lower his eyes, though he was sorely tempted to. Albus had only spoken the truth, even if Severus found himself unable to do the same. "How can you expect me to wait on the sidelines while very real threats to his life draw closer?" Severus asked, a faint tremble of desperation lacing his words. "How do you propose to protect your child should you die in the process?" "I would lay my life on the line by throwing yourself into danger due to an ill-conceived notion of repentance." "Aye, you will remain by Harry's side," said Albus. "You will provide for him, nurture him, and give him the love he needs. I will put my life on the line to protect him, to protect our world, to protect you, and die if need be." "I do not need protecting." Severus snapped his mouth shut when Albus stood up to lean over the desk and latched his hands onto Severus' shoulders in a claw-like grip. He met Albus' eyes, grateful now more than ever for his prowess in occlumency. It had been a long time since he'd seen the old man look quite so fierce. "I will protect you," Albus said, "as I should have done long ago." Severus averted his eyes. "You are but 31, a young man with a long life ahead of you. I will not allow you to cut it short." "You expect me to allow you? I have lived," Severus said Albus earnestly, his fingers still digging into Severus' shoulders. "More than my share. I have experienced. I have seen and done more than most will ever achieve. You have barely begun the walk down the strange and meandering path we call life." Severus shook his head, not so much in refusal as in denial. What was his life, compared to the lives of many, compared to Harry, or any of the other children who had not yet had their souls sullied by the unspeakable acts that had claimed his? Albus released Severus' shoulders and lowered himself into his seat. "If you won't do it for yourself, do it for your boy." His boy. Severus could find no words to respond. Harry was his, more than anything or anyone had ever been and ever would be. He could not fool himself into believing that Harry would not be hurt by the loss of his guardian, that Harry did not need him, not now, when he was still so young and vulnerable. Who would protect Harry, if not Severus? Who knew what the boy needed, what he desired, what he feared better than he? Whom could he trust to care for Harry in his absence? No one. He could trust no one. He struggled to trust even himself with the task. "I will do as you ask," Severus finally said, his voice emerging hoarsely. "I will not succumb to the temptation of repentance through death." He paused, boring his eyes into Albus. "Can you say the same?" He rose abruptly from his seat. "Don't leave your mess behind." Without waiting for a response, Severus turned and strode out of the headmaster's office. His feet carried him to his office by muscle memory alone, where he would remain seated at his desk, scarcely moving, for an indeterminate number of hours. Albus, upon the door of his office slamming shut, sagged in his seat, feeling every year of his age. Harry slept fitfully, his dreams haunted by cold laughter and glowing red eyes. Far above the highest tower of the castle, the jagged remains of Tom Riddle's soul raged. And far, far below, beneath the deepest dungeons, a rat with a missing toe scurried out of sight. Chapter 42. Good enough. Chapter text, "My rat's gone missing," Harry heard Ron complain to Dean Thomas, where he was seated several desks away. It was their first defense against the dark arts lesson since last week, when Quirrell had taken a sudden leave of absence. Who their new professor would be was anyone's guess. Harry hadn't seen any unfamiliar faces at the staff table at breakfast, though Severus had looked even more dour than usual, frequently shooting murderous glares at Dumbledore out of the corner of his eye, of which the headmaster seemed blissfully unaware. But that was only when Severus' eyes weren't boring into the side of Harry's head. Had he been keeping an eye on Harry's eating habits? Annoyed, Harry had stared the man in the face and shoved a bite of food in his mouth, but Severus had just raised an eyebrow. At that point, Harry had given up trying to figure out what the hell was up with him. "Maybe Mrs. Norris got him," Seamus said helpfully. Ron turned back to stare at him, wide-eyed and pale, and Hermione smacked Seamus over the head with a scroll of parchment. "Perhaps he's just gotten lost," said Hermione, shooting Seamus a reproachful glare. "Scabbers does go off on his own sometimes, doesn't he?" Ron didn't look mollified. Yeah, but never for this long. Good thing I've got an owl as a pet, Harry mused as he thumbed through his textbook. Magical owls seem to have an innate sense of direction. Were they bred that way, or is there some sort of spell? Who do you reckon our new professor is? Anthony asked, twisting around towards the half-open door. Maybe they'll get another ghost, Sue said dryly. That would be an improvement, Harry muttered. At least his head wouldn't be exploding in pain. The classroom went silent when the door was pulled open to reveal their new professor. Good morning, the thin, tired-looking man said as he strode towards the front of the classroom and set his threadbare briefcase on the desk. His hair was light brown, streaked with grey, and his face was faintly lined, with a thin scar running across one cheek as though it had been sliced through. My name is Professor Remus Lupin. He proceeded to take roll, and when he reached Harry's name, his eyes lingered for a brief moment. Harry dropped his eyes, and the man continued with a faint clearing of his throat. Once Ron raised a half-hearted hand in response to his name being called. Professor Lupin rolled up the parchment and set his hands on the edge of the desk behind him and leaned against it, fixing them all with a half-smile which quickly faded into a focused expression when he began to speak. Riddle me this. You're alone in an unfamiliar location, and you've been cornered by an individual or multiple individuals who are clearly more experienced than yourselves. Your first years, and you've only had so much opportunity to train. No matter how talented, how hardworking, how powerful you are, you cannot hope to hold your own in a duel against a fully trained wizard, or even one with several years more training than yourselves. Well, that sounds promising, Harry thought, frowning. Is he trying to prevent us from becoming overconfident? What's your best bet when you're alone and you can't call for help? The room was silent for a long moment as Professor Lupin eyed each of them in turn. Run for your life, Dean finally said. Lupin inclined his head, smiling. If you can find an opportunity to escape, that would be an excellent strategy. Play dead, Mandy offered. Lupin caught her eye. That is a sound suggestion in some cases, but in the event of an attack, there are too many holes in that strategy for it to be recommended. He glanced around the room. What would you say are some of the flaws in that plan? You'd be left defenseless, Harry thought. They might finish the job off anyway or notice you breathing. You might not be very good at playing dead, said Padma, and they won't necessarily leave the moment you drop to the ground. Lupin nodded. Correct. You'd be putting yourself in a very vulnerable position. He glanced around the room again. Any other ideas? Create a diversion, suggested Terry. Solid idea, said Lupin, clapping his hands together once. What are some diversion strategies that come to mind? Magna tumultum, the spell to create an explosive noise. Harry wondered. They might turn their head and give you a chance to escape. He opened his mouth, then snapped it shut. What if it was the wrong answer? Smokescreen spell, Hermione and Lisa both said at the same time. Lupin pressed his palms together. Excellent suggestion. 5 points to Gryffindor and Ravenclaw. Hermione beamed, and Lisa tried to pretend she didn't care. There are a number of spells that can be used to create a diversion, such as the lightning spell to create a flash of blinding light, or the bursting spell to produce a distracting noise. Harry lifted his eyes. So he'd been right. However, both of those spells are a bit more advanced than the smokescreen spell, which is what we'll be learning today. Are we going to have practical lessons all the time? Anthony interjected. 'Cause we only got to do that like once a month with Quirrell. Harry half expected Lupin to take points for the interruption, but he only smiled. That is my intention, he said. I believe practical lessons to be most effective, especially at this stage in your studies. He straightened up, smoothing the threadbare lapel of his robes. Now, in reference to my little introduction, that is what the focus of this class is going to be. How to maximize your chances of survival when you're at a disadvantage. Will we have homework? Seamus asked. Lupin looked a bit amused. On occasion, yes. But what kind of professor would I be otherwise? A few people laughed at that, and soon the desks were cleared away and they were set to practice the new spell. Harry retreated to the back of the room to attempt the spell on his own, keeping one eye on Lupin, who was circling the classroom to offer tips and corrections when necessary. Harry grinned when a billow of grey, odourless smoke rushed out of his wand, just as had been described in the textbook. It faded very quickly, though, and Harry frowned. Is it the power of the spell that makes it last longer, or the intent behind it? Fumo, Harry said loudly as he waved his wand, his voice barely audible amid the echoing shouts of his classmates. The smoke that emerged from his wand was as thick and grey as ever, but it didn't last any longer. "Well done, Harry," Harry flailed, his arms coming up protectively when a hand landed on his shoulder. He jerked up his head to meet Professor Lupin's eyes, who had taken a step back and looked slightly surprised. Willing his face not to noticeably redden, Harry stared back, forcing his arms down to rest at his sides. "Stop being pathetic. He's not going to attack you. He's not even the type." That was a stupid assumption to make. After a long pause, Lupin said, "Why don't you demonstrate the spell for me once more?" Harry set his jaw and shot the spell straight in the man's direction. He had asked. When the smoke faded, Lupin nodded in approval. "How can I make it last longer?" Harry forced himself to ask. "That will come with a bit more practice. But isn't there something I can do to make it better now? You're doing everything correctly." Harry frowned, "but the spell isn't lasting long enough. The book said it can last up to 2 minutes, and it's fading after 30 seconds. Harry." Harry snapped his mouth shut, holding his breath as Lupin stepped a bit closer. The man didn't try to touch Harry again, so he stayed where he was for the moment. "Take a look around you." Nonplussed, Harry glanced around the room at his classmates, all of whom were performing the spell to varying degrees of success. "No other student in this class has conjured a smoke screen that has lasted as long as yours." Harry squinted at the smoky results of his classmates' efforts. Lupin couldn't be right, could he? Harry wasn't doing anything special. He darted his eyes away, staring at his shoes, and with a quiet, "Well done," Lupin walked away. Harry stared after him as he approached one of the Gryffindors, who seemed to be having trouble. Was Lupin right? Was Harry's spell really the best in the class? Anthony's spells were always best in charms, and Lisa usually got things really quickly in transfiguration, and Hermione was top of the year in most classes. But Harry, sure, he did fine, but he wasn't the best. He wasn't supposed to be the best at anything. Supposed to be. Where had that thought come from? How lovely. Petunia all but smothered Dudley with kisses when he proudly presented his art project from school. She pinned it on the fridge, right in the center, where it was surrounded by Dudley's myriad other drawings and projects. Harry couldn't say that the drawings were bad, even though he would have felt better if they were. Then, Harry would be able to say that Petunia was just pretending to like them. But it was clear that she really did, and was proud of Dudley's work. Sure, she heaped praise on Dudley for tying his shoes correctly in the morning, but it seemed that even Dudley could tell the difference between praise for stupid things and real praise for things he'd done well. He usually just scowled when he got praise for the former and demanded more sugar in his porridge or sweets for school, but for his projects, he always looked really pleased. Curiously, when Dudley presented his project to Uncle Vernon when he arrived home from work, the man only gave the project a cursory glance, leaving Dudley crestfallen. Harry couldn't understand why Dudley cared. Wasn't it enough that Aunt Petunia liked it? Uncle Vernon was proud when Dudley played sports, and he attended nearly every game, never mind that Dudley wasn't very good. Uncle Vernon was dumb anyway and mean, so who cared what he thought? He made up things in his head about Harry all the time and hit him for it, so his thoughts weren't even real. Aunt Petunia, though. Harry would have given anything, anything at all, for her to look at him the way she'd looked at Dudley, even just once. He probably wouldn't get any hugs, but the look would be enough. The problem was that Harry just wasn't as good at art projects as Dudley. He was a better reader and speller, and he got better marks on nearly everything. He was even good enough at maths that scary Mr. McGrady had never yelled at him once. But that wasn't what Aunt Petunia cared about, so it didn't matter. So Harry tried really, really hard on the next project they did at school. He colored inside all the lines, drew flowers because Aunt Petunia liked them, and added glitter, even though it was messy and got stuck underneath his fingernails. Even better, Dudley was so engrossed in his own project that he didn't even try to pick on Harry. By the end, Harry could confidently say it was the best project he'd ever done. He handed it tentatively to Aunt Petunia after she hung Dudley's project on the fridge. She'd like it. She had to. He never worked as hard on a project before. She held it between two fingers and eyed it for a moment, her face looking sort of flat. She tossed it carelessly on the table without a word and began to walk away, then stopped and shrieked at the glitter that had scattered across the table and floor. All Harry got from her was a slap and a broom to clean up the mess, and Harry knew it was because he wasn't good enough. "He's miles better than Quirrell," said Anthony, bounding over to match Harry's stride when they were dismissed. "We're going to get to do this every lesson, and he didn't even give us homework today." "I wonder why he wasn't hired from the start," said Harry. "Was it Dumbledore who made those decisions, or the school board?" "Maybe he'll teach us to duel," Padma said excitedly. "I've watched a few competitions." "What was it like?" Harry asked, turning his head. "Oh, it was mad. The competitors were moving so fast that the commentator couldn't even keep up, and they did nearly everything non-verbally. Harry would be that good one day. He makes sure of it. It was cold and rainy today, so most of his classmates opted to stay indoors for their break, but Harry had grown accustomed to stepping outside after defense to help clear away his headache. Of course, that wasn't necessary today, but he felt compelled to get some fresh air, regardless. Maybe Quirrell wore some sort of cologne that I'm allergic to, Harry wondered as he walked against the heavy wind outside. Sometimes there had been a strange smell about the man, though it certainly hadn't smelled like cologne. Lost in thought, Harry nearly walked into someone, stopping in his tracks before stepping on the toes of Malfoy. Of course. Harry lifted his chin, clutching the handle of his wand in his pocket. But Malfoy didn't seem like he was angling for a fight, and he looked rather odd without the ever-present sneer marring his features. Harry sidestepped him and made to go in the opposite direction. "Wait!" Harry turned back to him, narrowing his eyes. "What do you want?" Malfoy's eyes darted around, as if checking for eavesdroppers, then met Harry's for a brief moment before glancing away. "What does he see in you?" Harry's eyebrows rose to his hairline. "Sorry, what?" Malfoy flushed. "Professor Snape," he muttered, swallowing audibly. "I was in detention for a week because of you." "It wasn't because of me," Harry snapped. "No one asked you to break my glasses and create an idiotic rivalry with me. I was perfectly happy to never look in your smug face again, but you just had to keep coming at me." Harry cut himself off. He'd already said more than he meant to. "I don't get it," Malfoy burst out, though thankfully he didn't step any closer. "It was supposed to be me. I'm the one he knew before Hogwarts. I'm in Slytherin. You're just a boring Ravenclaw that for some reason he likes better than me." He folded his arms across his chest, looking like nothing more than a pouting toddler. Harry rolled his eyes so hard he practically saw his brain. "Why don't you take this up with him then, if you're so close?" Malfoy scuffed the ground with his shoe. "I did, and he told me to mind my own business. And you think I'll tell you anything different?" Malfoy stared at him for a long moment. "It's just, you're Harry Potter. You've already got everyone fawning all over you." The boy paused to heave a breath. "Why do you have to have him too?" Harry just stared incredulously for a moment. "Are you bloody joking?" he burst out, though it was obvious that Malfoy was deadly serious. "I don't know where you get off thinking you know anything about me, but you don't have a damn clue." Harry snapped his mouth shut before he'd say something he regretted. Malfoy's eyes were wide. "But everyone knows. Everyone's an idiot," Harry cut in, scowling. "Why don't you just worry about yourself, leave me the hell alone, and we'll both be better off for it?" Without another word, Harry turned and walked away. What gives him the right? Harry fumed as he stalked in whatever direction would take him furthest from Malfoy. The audacity. A seating like he knows me, like I'm the one with special privileges, when he's probably never gone a day without food. Harry made his way back into the castle, still fuming, when he started to feel droplets of rain fall on his head. But once seated in a quiet corner of the library with a stack of books, another thought began to overshadow the anger. Severus had really meant it, that he'd give Malfoy detention. It wasn't that Harry hadn't believed him, but it was still hard to believe, if that made any sense at all. Well, it would be a lot easier to ignore Malfoy now if the boy tried starting something with him again. He'd inadvertently revealed to Harry his weakness, and he wasn't a threat. Not anymore. Just jealous, for some incomprehensible reason. The rest of the day went by quietly. They had the afternoon free, with astronomy at midnight, and Harry managed to finish all of his homework as well as get a head start for double potions tomorrow. He might have been better off focusing on transfiguration, but he couldn't be bothered. Astronomy was fine, even relaxing. The skies had cleared after the rainfall, and Harry found himself staring through the lens of his telescope much longer than he needed to, the view quite mesmerizing. As relaxed as he felt by the time the lesson ended, Harry was sure he'd have no trouble sleeping, and it was easy at first. He dropped off moments after his head hit the pillow, but he jerked awake less than 30 minutes later. his heart thumping as though he'd been physically shaken out of his sleep. But no one had touched him, and he hadn't even had the chance to start dreaming. The same pattern occurred several more times, and fed up and exhausted, Harry sat up in his bed, breathing deliberately slowly, long, deep breaths that made him feel a little light-headed. Perhaps too light-headed, because he found himself sliding out of bed and, safely concealed inside the silky curtains of his four-poster bed, Harry sat cross-legged atop his blankets, rolling a small metal object from one hand to another. The pull to it had been nothing short of magnetic. He couldn't even entirely remember retrieving the box from his trunk, as though he were in a trance, only coming back to himself when the knife was in his hands. Harry paused in his motion and lifted the penknife to eye level, staring at his reflection in the metal of the blade. He lowered it, smoothing his finger across the flat side. It was just like his old one, really, the differences so negligible that they couldn't quite be described. He'd missed having this. It had been his security blanket for a while, the one thing he could cling to when he'd been homeless, and the only thing he could rely on in his early days with Severus, when he'd been so unsure of his standing there, terrified that the man would hurt him in ways the Dursleys never could have. With magic, at first, and later with rejection, abandonment. At least he'd have his penknife when he lost everything else. But then Harry clenched his jaw, squeezing the handle of the knife so hard his hand ached. He loosened his grip and stroked his finger carefully along the blade, this time on the sharp end. Any sudden movement and he'd break the skin, it would be so easy. No. Number Harry dropped the blade as though it had burned white-hot. What was wrong with him? He didn't want that. He didn't. Nothing was even wrong. Everything was going well. Everything was fine. He'd written one of his best transfiguration essays yet, which he'd definitely get top marks on, and they were finally brewing enhancement potions in class. He'd done the best spell in Dada, apparently, and he still needed to learn. Harry's hands reached for the penknife as though magically compelled to, and he was staring at his reflection again, the green of his eyes glowing ominously in the dim light his wand was providing. Is that me? Am I real? Ouch. Harry let out an unwitting squeak of pain when the tip of the blade nicked his finger. The knife slipped from his hands, and he stared at his finger, watching as a tiny drop of blood dribbled sluggishly from the cut. It was barely anything. It didn't even hurt after the initial shock. He grabbed hold of the blade again, a bit more gingerly this time. Skin was so fragile, so easy to cut. Humans were fragile, so easy to kill. I'll try not to die. He'd said that to Severus. He'd promised, after the man, in a moment of uncharacteristic candidness, had confessed to Harry his greatest fear. Severus had given him everything. Harry took a great, shuddering gasp and leaped to his feet, shoving the penknife into his pocket. He fished for his invisibility cloak before he'd fully realized what he intended to do, but he had to. He had to go to Severus. He'd promised he would if this happened, and he didn't want to hurt Severus. Severus had demonstrated to him over and over again that he mattered, to some people at least, that they thought he was good enough to keep around. Harry would be hurting more than just himself if he did this. That had to be a good enough reason to stop. You will fight until you want to. Truly, Harry didn't want this for himself. Concealed beneath his invisibility cloak, it was easy to sneak out of the common room, despite the late hour, and Harry's feet carried him down the familiar path to the dungeons, to Snape's office, which opened at his touch. He leveled his wand at the bookshelf and darted through it, then slumped against the inside of the closed door and gasped for breath as though he'd just run a mile. When his heart rate finally slowed to a reasonable pace, Harry pulled off his cloak and moved to stand outside the door of Severus' bedroom. For some reason, Harry expected Severus to have heard him, to have sensed his presence, perhaps, and emerged from his room unprompted, sparing Harry the discomfort of knocking on the door. But the quarters were still and silent, and Harry had no choice. Taking another long breath, Harry raised his fist and knocked on the door, 3 firm knocks that could not be mistaken for anything but yet nothing. Harry knocked again, more frantically this time. Where is he? Why isn't he coming? Harry's throat was beginning to feel tight. He tried knocking on the other doors, the one that led to the private potions lab, the lavatory. Nothing. Desperate now, Harry opened the door to Severus' bedroom and peeked inside cautiously, but the bed was empty, as was the bathroom. The laboratory was locked, But if Snape was working in there, he surely would have heard Harry by now. Severus wasn't here. The realization made Harry feel a bit empty. It was a strange feeling, but not one he'd never encountered. He felt that way sometimes when he awoke from the good dreams with his mum in them. He'd open his eyes, and there'd be a brief moment when he half expected her to still be there. But reality would immediately come crashing down, leaving him with that gnawing feeling that was not unlike the hunger he felt after days spent in his cupboard without meals. He should probably leave. Yet the thought of trekking all the way back to Ravenclaw Tower was the last thing Harry wanted to engage with right now. His panicked urgency had propelled him along the lengthy route to the dungeons, but now he just felt drained. Harry let out a long breath, then staggered over to the sofa, taking a moment to shove the penknife between the seat cushions. He wrapped his cloak around himself like a blanket, lay back, and let sleep take him. Chapter 43. More than that. Chapter text. What in Merlin's name? Harry awoke abruptly at the sensation of something being yanked off of him. He sat up straight with a gasp to see Severus standing inches away, holding the invisibility cloak out in front of him between two fingers. The previous night's events came rushing back to him, and Harry's face burned. Severus must have been really perturbed to find him sleeping here, half invisible, and he'd never given Harry an open invitation to crash on his sofa whenever he pleased. Harry bit his lip when Severus met his eyes. Well, the man snapped. Hunching his shoulders, Harry glanced pointedly away. What was Severus expecting? That he'd spill his guts with the man standing over him, very obviously pissed off. Harry, Severus said in a clear tone of warning. Harry re-established eye contact, glaring. You didn't ask a question. Severus clenched his jaw and sucked in a breath through his teeth. How did you come by this artifact? Dumbledore gave it to me. The expression on the man's face grew positively fearsome. Dumbledore gave you that absolute fool. It was my father's, Harry snapped. And now it's mine. Severus took several long breaths as though fortifying himself and conjured a stiff-backed chair to sit across from Harry, setting the cloak down on the sofa. How long have you been here? I came last night, and you weren't here. Harry hated how his voice cracked at the end of his sentence, but Severus hadn't been there, and he'd said Harry should come if he needed. Severus' face tightened. I was unexpectedly called away to consult on a time-sensitive stage in a potion, which consumed most of my night. I did not expect. His voice trailed off, and he leaned in closer to Harry. I regret that I was not here when you arrived. Harry looked down, his mouth trembling a little. He didn't have a right to be upset, did he? Severus hadn't ignored him. He hadn't even known Harry was here. But it was hard not to feel betrayed. He said he'd be here. He said I should come, and I needed him. Why did you come here, Harry? Severus asked in a softer voice. He reached over to tilt up Harry's face, and Harry swallowed against the lump growing in his throat. Aye, he swallowed again, his eyes watering. He pulled away and drew his knees close to his chest, hiding his face. He wasn't crying, he wasn't. He just didn't want to see the look on Severus' face when he learned what Harry had nearly done. Without lifting his head, Harry dug his hand between the sofa cushions to pull out the penknife and shoved it into Severus' hands. The man was silent for several long moments before he tugged on Harry's wrists, forcing him to uncurl, and pushed up his sleeves, undoubtedly to check for any injuries Harry might have inflicted upon himself. Harry kept his eyes squeezed shut, and he stiffened in surprise when the sofa dipped beside him and Severus pulled him into a tight hug. You're all right, Severus murmured. You're all right. Harry got the sense that Severus wasn't really directing the words at him. Harry's body slowly relaxed, and he fully leaned into the hug, pressing his face into Severus' shoulder. I'm very sorry, Harry. Those words seemed to break something open in Harry, and he was suddenly crying, trembling in the man's embrace, his breaths hitching every few moments. It was okay. Severus hadn't been here before, but he was now. He hadn't meant to leave Harry alone. He hadn't abandoned him. He'd messed up, just like Harry did sometimes, but he hadn't meant to. And he wasn't trying to justify it or tell Harry not to be upset. The tears didn't stop, but Harry didn't really want them to. They didn't feel like sad tears or hurt tears or angry tears. They felt like relief. He let them run their course, rushing through him like a waterfall, and Severus didn't let him go. He was rocking Harry now, a bit like he was a baby, but Harry didn't want it to stop. When the tears finally ebbed, Harry didn't move. He latched his fists onto Severus' robes, just in case, and let out a sigh as the man rubbed a hand up and down his back. It was strange how a simple touch could feel so good. A part of Harry felt like he should be embarrassed, but the other part of him was telling that feeling to bugger off. Why shouldn't he have this? What was so bad about clinging to his guardian and having his back rubbed? Severus wasn't going to leave, no matter how needy Harry was being at the moment. He made a small noise of protest when Severus shifted, but he quieted when the man let out a low chuckle. I'm moving to a more sustainable position. No need to panic. Severus did a bit of maneuvering so that he was seated properly and arranged Harry to lie across the sofa with his head on Severus' lap. Man began carding his fingers through Harry's hair, and Harry closed his eyes again, his breath slow and even. He could almost fall asleep like this, except that he wanted to stay awake and be aware of this happening. Finally, Harry rolled over a little, and Severus immediately recognized what Harry wanted and pulled him up into a sitting position, sliding his discarded glasses onto his face. Harry rubbed at his itchy eyes beneath the lenses and slumped backwards against the sofa. Can you look at me? Harry looked up at Severus, finding it surprisingly easy to do. It was also surprisingly easy to explain when asked what had happened, how he'd made the penknife, what he'd been feeling last night, and how he'd come down under his invisibility cloak because he'd promised he would. I don't want to do it, Harry said, biting his lip. I don't know what I was feeling, but I knew I needed to stop. And so you did. Severus clasped Harry's shoulder. I am very, very pleased that you were able to muster up the wherewithal to stop yourself and to seek help. He paused for a moment, his eyes fixed on Harry's. You have made me very proud. Harry couldn't stop himself from smiling, his cheeks feeling warm. He hadn't really thought about it before, but he wanted to make Severus proud of him. He didn't want to be the terrified little kid that Severus had to protect. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to be someone Severus could trust. And maybe he'd always have that scared part of him that needed Severus to be there to make sure it was safe, but that was okay, as long as he was more than that. I suppose I cannot begrudge you that infernal cloak. Harry glanced over at it, crumpled innocently at the corner of the sofa, having forgotten it in all the commotion. You're going to let me keep it? Severus pinched the bridge of his nose. Against my better judgment. I can see the benefits it may provide, but they don't overshadow the endless opportunity for mischief and danger it opens to you. I haven't gotten into any trouble with it, Harry countered. I've had it for ages. The restricted section definitely doesn't count as trouble. Severus gave him a look which indicated that he didn't believe it for a moment, but evidently he was willing to ignore it for now. Of course, I will only allow this upon the condition that you do me the courtesy of refraining from situating yourself upon my furniture whilst concealed beneath it. I'd hate to sit on you. Harry let out a surprised laugh. Somehow, the possibility of that happening hadn't crossed his mind. Severus leaned back into the sofa, and Harry noticed for the first time how tired he looked. He had been awake all night. What kind of potion were you working on? Harry asked, resting his cheek against the cushion behind his head. I've developed a formulation that can be added to medicinal potions to automatically adjust the potency to the patient's age and weight without requiring dosages to be measured out, Severus explained. A young potioneer requested the opportunity to test it, and seeing as the formulation may react to certain potions unpredictably, I have been required to oversee certain stages of testing. So where did you go last night? France. Harry's eyes went wide. You went to France? Severus smiled a bit at Harry's reaction. The wizarding governments of Britain and France have a travel agreement that allows direct apparition and flu networks between countries, so it's really no different than traveling between cities in England or from London to Dublin. Can you travel anywhere in the world that easily? Severus smoothed the front of his robes. It's not physically possible to apparate or flew directly to areas beyond a certain distance, such as in the case of the Americas, despite Britain having attained similar agreements with several countries in that region. What happens if you try to apparate or flew that far? The rate of splinching when attempting to apparate across such a distance is close to 70%, and there have been a number of reported instances of travelers falling short of their destination and landing in the ocean. As for the flu, there are simply no reliable networks that can traverse an ocean as large as the Atlantic. Harry had a sudden mental image of several limbs popping out of nowhere in some city in America, while the owner of those limbs floated aimlessly across the ocean. He suppressed a laugh. How do people get there then? Fly, mainly. Severus looked sour at the thought. One of many reasons I prefer to do business on this side of the Atlantic. Harry grinned. I want to fly over the Atlantic. Severus scowled at him. Not on my life, you won't. Harry laughed, the sound emerging loudly and unrestrained, and Severus' face softened, the laugh lines around his eyes briefly overshadowing the dark circles beneath. What time is it? Harry asked with a yawn. 8:15, Severus replied, his eyes darting towards his wristwatch. You best get ready for class. I don't want to, Harry muttered, swinging his legs. Severus studied him for a moment. I can arrange for you to be excused from your morning lessons today, he said evenly, to Harry's surprise. I will order in breakfast for us if you'd like. Harry nodded eagerly, taken aback at his good fortune. Snape summoned a house elf to bring Harry's clothes, and he hurried to change in the bathroom. When he returned, the table was laid out with all of Harry's favorite breakfast items, where they both seated themselves and ate in companionable silence. Is this what it's like to have a parent? They can see you at your worst, at your most pathetic, and not get annoyed or angry. But Severus isn't really my parent. He's my guardian. What are you? Harry blurted out. To me, I mean. He tried not to acknowledge the rising heat on his face. Severus set down his fork. Are you inquiring as to the legal status of my custody over you? Harry nodded, chewing his lip, grateful for Severus' ability to decipher Harry's poor excuse for a question. In the British wizarding legal system, there are 3 types of guardianships that may be granted, said Severus. The first is defined as a temporary guardianship, whereby guardianship over a minor is granted to an individual for a set period of time, and at its end, the contract is either nullified or given an extension. Harry's stomach dropped a little. Is that what you? No, Severus interjected. I have been granted permanent guardianship, which is given similar permanence to formal adoption. Harry furrowed his brow. What's the difference? Severus set his palms flat on the table. Both permanent guardianships and adoptions are granted upon the adult and minor child over the age of 7 signing a legally binding contract, he explained. In the case of an adoption, the parent-child relationship is viewed no differently by law than a biological relationship. Severus focused his gaze upon Harry. Neither party has the option to repudiate their agreement, and custody may only be rescinded if the adoptive parent is found unfit, just as would be the case with a biological parent. He paused. Permanent guardianships, on the other hand, can be nullified if both parties willingly agree to repudiate the relationship. Is that the only real difference? Harry asked, unsure of why his shoulders had tensed at Severus' explanation. More or less, said Severus. It is equally secure in that the child cannot be removed from the guardian on the whim of a third party, which, when I submitted my application for guardianship, was my primary concern. Why did you do this and not adoption? Harry asked. At some point, he'd grabbed hold of his fork and started mashing his food into unidentifiable lumps. Several reasons. Severus paused to take a sip of tea. One is that the process of obtaining permanent guardianship is faster and less involved. Albus' influence in the ministry was sufficient to grant me guardianship without undue difficulty. In the case of adoption, however, I would have been required to undergo an extensive background check, which I feared my legal history may not have withstood. Oh, additionally, Severus cleared his throat. I initially feared that you agreed to the guardianship with limited knowledge of what to expect in my care, and with precious little understanding of what to expect of a caregiver, generally speaking. Harry frowned, confused. I don't understand. Severus let out a breath, his fingers tightening around the handle of his teacup. I feared that, given time, you would find my care to be insufficient and would regret accepting the guardianship, so I wanted to avail you of the option to pursue a different guardian should you wish it. Harry stared for a moment. So if I was really angry at you, and then I said I wanted a new guardian, you would agree? Snape let out a scoffing sound, releasing his grip on his cup. Now, certainly not. I would no sooner repudiate you than any of your friends' biological parents would do so in response to a fit of pique from their child. Harry hadn't noticed how tensely he was holding himself until his shoulders dropped in relief. Then why did you want to give me the choice, if you wouldn't, agree to it? Severus tilted his head. Initially, I felt otherwise. I, quite frankly, doubted my ability to provide for your needs and thought perhaps a child such as yourself would benefit from a guardian with greater experience and a more caring temperament. Harry stared at the table. I wouldn't. I mean, I don't want a different guardian. He glanced up when Severus' hand covered his own. You won't be getting a different guardian. I can assure you of that. Once the breakfast dishes were cleared away, Severus disappeared into his bedroom to prepare for the day, while Harry settled on the couch to read one of the obscure defense texts he'd found on a bookshelf. It almost felt like being back at Severus' house. He glanced up when he heard the man's footsteps approach. You are excused from your morning classes, but I expect to see you in potions class after lunch, said Severus, closing the latch on his briefcase. Okay, Harry said quietly, fiddling with a thread that had detached from the book binding. Severus eyed him carefully. If you need me for any reason, you may find me in the potions classroom. Harry nodded, curling up into a more comfortable position on the sofa and thumbing through the book. He was startled when Severus, who had already opened the door, turned on his heel and approached abruptly, reaching over to brush his hand down the back of Harry's head and squeezed the back of his neck. The man's hand rested there for a moment, warm and secure, and whatever tension had remained in Harry's body after all that had happened faded away. He wrapped his hand around Severus' forearm, the steadiness of it feeling like an anchor that he could hang onto forever and trust that it wouldn't give way under the pressure. Just before releasing him, Severus murmured something under his breath, and while Harry couldn't make out the words he'd said, a rush of warmth that could only be magic settled over him like a blanket. Another squeeze of Harry's shoulder, and Severus was gone. The morning passed by uneventfully. It had been a while since Harry had had so much time to himself without interruption. As friendly as his housemates were, sometimes things got to be a little overwhelming. Far sooner than Harry had expected, Severus returned, looking rather harried and muttering under his breath about dunderheads. Is it lunchtime already? Harry asked. Severus shook his head. I've yet another class to teach shortly, more fool me. Harry bit back a snort. Clearly this wasn't the time. Are you hungry? Severus asked, turning to sort through a stack of parchments on his desk. Not really. Severus found the parchment he was looking for and turned back around. You're welcome to anything in the cupboards if you change your mind. When Severus returned some 45 minutes later, Harry suppressed a sigh, knowing that his peaceful morning was at an end. I am required to show my face in the great hall for at least one meal a day, he said with a sour expression on his face. I won't be leaving you here alone, so you best get yourself ready. Harry sighed. What's the point of going all the way up there just to come back for potions? You make the fundamental error of assuming logic behind the many decisions made by the school board. Harry couldn't hold back a snort at that, and Severus sort of sagged, reaching over to pull Harry to his feet. Where have you been all morning? Sue asked as Harry slid into the seat next to her at the table. Harry filled the glass in front of him with pumpkin juice and took a sip, more as an attempt to stall than to quench his thirst. He cleared his throat. I was excused from lessons. Are you ill? Sue asked, her forehead furrowing. Harry twitched his shoulders in a semblance of a shrug, half shaking his head, half nodding, then reached for a buttered roll. Thankfully, Sue let it go, and Harry let the conversation of his classmates wash over him as he chewed, rather disinterested in what he was putting in his mouth. He stayed quiet as he walked with his classmates down to the dungeons for potions. Interestingly, whenever anyone so much as made an attempt to engage him, Sue would step in front of Harry or change the topic of conversation. Harry couldn't have been more grateful. The lesson went smoothly as well, Harry and Sue working alongside each other with practiced ease, and aside from a near mishap with a broken bottle of powdered bicorn horn, they brewed their potion without a hitch. Mr. Potter, stay after, Severus said just after he dismissed the class. Harry obediently approached the desk and waited until the room had cleared out. Once it did, Severus stood up and led Harry to his office. I find myself at a bit of a loss for how to handle this issue, Severus said when they were both seated. Handle what issue? Severus raised his eyebrows. You came very close to harming yourself last night. I admit I had not foreseen the extent of your ingenuity in that you would be capable of transfiguring a weapon. Harry bit his lip. But I didn't. I know you didn't. And as I have said, I am proud of you for refraining. He heaved a breath. Yet I can hardly confiscate your wand, and I cannot keep you in sight for every hour of the day. Harry's face heated. I don't need, I'm not going to try it again. He quieted when Severus put a hand on his shoulder. I know you don't intend to. Yet difficulties such as this tend to resurface at unexpected and inopportune times, Harry grimaced, shrugging off the man's hand. Why doesn't he just say he thinks I'm a head case instead of covering it with pretty words? I have no choice but to allow you a greater degree of independence than would be necessary were we at home, said Severus. I want to see you in my quarters every day after dinner at the least, and I will check on you as frequently as I see fit. Tracking spells cannot be reliably maintained on Hogwarts grounds, and I cannot keep you confined to my quarters. Well, that explained the spell Severus had murmured that morning, so my only option is to keep a close eye on you. Harry's shoulders stiffened. So this is what I get for coming to you. You treat me like I'm mental, he glared. Maybe next time I just won't say anything. Severus narrowed his eyes, the tired lines fading away in the face of his anger. I am doing what I have to do to keep you safe. You may rail at me all you wish, but I will not allow you free rein to harm yourself. His face then briefly took on an expression that Harry had never seen him make before. He looked frightened, and that alone was enough to quell the frustration that was building up. I will do everything in my power to ensure your survival, even if you may despise me for it. Severus had said that months ago, and one thing Harry knew for certain was that the man never went back on his word, even if Harry didn't like it. As requested, Harry returned to the potions classroom after dinner and stopped in his tracks when he saw Anthony standing over a cauldron surrounded by a mess of potions ingredients, utterly absorbed in his task. Ugh, what are you? Harry trailed off when it became apparently that Anthony hadn't even noticed his entrance. Severus beckoned from his desk, and Harry dropped into a seat in front of it. Why's Anthony here? Harry asked under his breath. That is a question for Mr. Goldstein to answer. Harry blinked, glancing over at Anthony again, who seemed so engrossed in his work that the room could have turned neon purple and he wouldn't have noticed the change. He'd have to ask later. Well, as you see, Harry said, speaking under his breath so that Anthony wouldn't overhear. I've managed not to off myself in the past hour and a half. Severus glared at him. You think that's amusing, do you? Harry couldn't help scowling. Do you want me to cry about it? I want you to understand the seriousness of this situation, Severus said in a quiet yet harsh voice. Harry set his jaw. I do. I came to you last night, didn't I? If I didn't think it was serious, I would have just... Severus held up a hand. It is not the time to discuss this, unless you want your friend to overhear us. Why did you make me come here, then? Harry snapped. Severus pinched the bridge of his nose. Because I need you in sight. With an exaggerated huff, Harry stomped over to one of the desks and yanked a textbook out of his bag at random. Severus let out a long, put-upon sigh. I'm done, Professor, Harry heard Anthony say sometime later. Anthony handed Severus a sample of whatever he'd just brewed, which the man quickly examined. Adequate, you may go. Severus might as well have gushed praises with the way Anthony's face lit up. His grin grew wider when he spotted Harry, apparently for the first time. Is Professor Snape letting you do extra credit? I know you don't need any help with potions. Something like that, Harry replied hesitantly. Why are you here? Anthony hitched his bag over his shoulder. SN Professor Snape said I could redo my potions for better marks. It's easier when it's quiet. Harry's eyes darted towards Severus, who was apparently engrossed in mocking essays. Anthony bounded out of the classroom, the door swinging shut behind him. Harry still sort of wanted to be angry, but most of his frustration had fizzled out, especially knowing that Severus had gone out of his way to help Anthony. Still, it was annoying that Severus couldn't trust Harry to be out of his sight for more than an hour at a time. Was this what it was going to be like from now on, just because Harry had slipped up once? He hadn't even done anything. Come here, Harry. Harry glanced up anxiously and wasted no time in approaching Severus' desk. He stood there silently waiting as Severus studied him for a moment. You've not done anything wrong, Severus said slowly. In fact, you've done everything right, and I am trying to do right by you in return. He inhaled sharply through his nose. Do you understand? Harry swallowed, trying not to look away. Yes, sir. Severus shook his head once, resting his hand on Harry's shoulder. No, sirs. Harry smiled just a little. Yes, Severus. Chapter 44. A Room of One's Own. Chapter text. Harry's surroundings were nothing but a rush of blurred shapes and colors as he flew backwards through the air at a rapid speed and bounced off the wall to land sprawling on the ground. He squeezed his eyes shut to counteract the dizziness, then blinked them open to see Neville standing several feet away with his wand outstretched, mouth agape. Harry got to his feet, thankful for the cushioning charms Lupin had cast on the walls and floor, and grinned. I did it. Neville asked, staring at his wand as though it had acted of its own accord. Pretty sure that was all you, said Harry, rolling back his shoulders. Wow. Well done, Neville, Lupin said, smiling warmly as he came up behind him. Like I said, it's just a matter of confidence, so it's important to trust yourself above all else. He clapped Neville on the shoulder before moving on. He really is a good teacher, Harry thought as he watched Lupin go. Neville had still been struggling with the knockback jinx for ages after they'd learned it with Quirrell, and none of Hermione's tutelage had helped. But just after a few lessons with Lupin, Neville had managed to perform one of the more powerful jinxes in the class. Thankfully, the professor was back to teaching after missing most of the previous week's lessons due to illness. No one had been pleased, considering that they had actually started learning useful spells and no one had been available to cover for him, but at least they were back to it now. What was wrong with Lupin anyway? He didn't seem very well, and he was sporting a limp that he'd not had before he'd taken ill. Do you want to take a turn? Neville asked, jerking Harry out of his thoughts. You can probably do this one in your sleep. They practiced for a while longer, until Lupin dismissed them, and the room filled with chatter as everyone gathered up their things. Harry's mind was several steps ahead. He'd run down to the library to finish his essay, grab lunch, and then get his broom from Severus and meet Sue and Stephen by the pitch. He'd promised them a go on his broom. Both of them had decent brooms at home, and Sue's was a better model than his, but neither of them had a parent on staff to hold it for them. The perks of having a professor for a guardian, Harry mused. It has to be good for something, considering Severus is watching my every move these days. It was annoying, but it didn't bother him quite as much anymore. Severus wasn't restricting his activities or anything, and it wasn't the worst thing in the world to retreat into the quiet of the man's quarters every evening. He'd taken to coming down under his invisibility cloak since Severus wanted him there early, just when his office hours ended, and Harry had learned in short order the responsibilities Severus held as a head of house. He'd nearly walked in on a meeting Severus was having with an older Slytherin student who appeared to be panicking about their upcoming OWLS, and another with several younger students who had been involved in some sort of altercation. I'm afraid it will have to be borne, Severus had said when Harry commented on it. You will always be my priority, and I will not have you waiting outside the door. So, invisibility cloak and muffling charms so Harry wouldn't overhear private conversations, it was. Harry had initially thought that Severus would insist on Harry sleeping in his quarters every night too, but the man had muttered something about Harry not needing any more social isolation, and said he'd be enacting localized tracking spells on Harry's dorm which would alert him if anything happened. Harry didn't even try to argue. At least those spells couldn't follow him all over the castle. Well, Severus was willing to give him some independence, considering that he wasn't even in his quarters when Harry went down to get his broom. He knew where it was, though, and it was nice that Severus trusted Harry this much. Apparently, Harry could be relied upon not to throw himself off his broom into oblivion. Harry made it to lunch with barely 10 minutes before it would be cleared away, and he quickly shoveled down a plate of the closest dish so he could meet Stephen and Sue on the pitch as planned. When he arrived, he was surprised to find them accompanied by Ron Weasley, whose eyes darted immediately towards Harry's broom. How do you manage to smuggle that here? He asked enviously. I didn't, said Harry, handing it over when it became obvious that Ron was refraining from asking for it. My Snape is storing it for me. No one objected to Ron taking the first turn on the broom, especially considering how morose he'd been since his rat had disappeared. At this point, no one was willing to say out loud the most likely scenario, that Scabbers had died of old age, or had been attacked or eaten. Ron was quite a good flyer from what Harry could see. His first few moments were shaky as he adjusted to the speed of a broom, but once he got his bearings, it was obvious that he'd been flying for years. When he landed, his face was flushed and momentarily happy before it drooped into the depressed look he'd been sporting. He must have really loved that rat. It's not like he ever did anything interesting, Ron mumbled when Sue took her turn on the broom. He wasn't even mine originally. Percy had him first. Did rats usually live that long, unless it was a magical rat? How old was he? Harry asked. Ron shrugged. Dunno, pretty old. Had a missing toe, but I think he was like that when Percy got him, probably cheaper that way. Did he seem ill at all before he disappeared? Harry was just throwing darts at this point, but it was better than saying nothing, with Ron looking so glum. No, he was the same as always. Sue landed a short while later and handed the broom over to Stephen, who'd been oblivious to their conversation and had taken to practicing broomstick maneuvers on the ground. Is it really just about the rat? Sue asked, brushing her tousled hair out of her face. What do you mean? Ron asked, looking as befuddled as Harry felt. What did Sue mean? Like you said, he was pretty old and never did much of anything. Harry winced internally, expecting Ron to respond angrily, but instead the other boy went quiet. I think, he began in a low voice, it's because when I got Scabbers, it was the first time I felt like I had something of my own. Ron stared at the ground, scuffing at the dirt with his shoe. He was Percy's first, but it was still, you know. Ron's response sent all three of them into quiet contemplation. It was interesting how Sue had been able to get to the heart of the matter like that. In a way, Harry could relate. He'd never been allowed anything of his own growing up, and the few things he'd managed to procure had been safely hidden away, despite the fact that they were just trinkets and truly worth nothing at all. But they had meant something to him because they were solely his. Harry did a double take when he walked into Severus' quarters that evening. There was something off about the space, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Were the dimensions different? How would that even be possible? Magic, obviously. Harry glanced over at Severus, ever present behind his desk. Why does the room look weird? Ah! Severus stood up abruptly and approached, pointing his wand at a door beside the bathroom, a door that definitely had not been there yesterday, and it swung open. He nudged Harry through the door by his shoulder. I had a bedroom installed for you. Harry looked up at Severus, nonplussed. You installed AY. Upon finding you asleep on my sofa, it occurred to me that I had not done my due diligence in making you feel properly at home here. But it's your quarters, Harry said, lost. Severus raised an eyebrow. I am aware. Harry glanced around the room. It was a modest size, smaller than his room at home, with a twin-size bed covered in navy blue bedsheets and a matching rug on the floor. A large bookshelf stood against the wall beside the bed, and a desk and chair were set up across from it. There was even a bedside table with a lamp. How did you? Harry broke off, staring at Severus with his mouth slightly agape. Severus smiled slightly. I required assistance from several Hogwarts house elves, who are quite adept at expanding spaces to suit their needs. Harry still couldn't wrap his head around it. Do you want me to sleep here? Because Harry flushed. If this was because of his issues, Severus shook his head. You are free to sleep wherever you wish. I simply want to make the option available to you. You deserve better than a sofa. Oh, Harry said in a small voice. He walked over to the bed and brushed his hand over the soft sheets. You didn't have to do this. Severus scoffed, drawing closer to run his hand through Harry's hair. Ridiculous boy. Harry leaned back his head slightly, smiling, and somehow the confusion faded. It would be nice to be able to retreat here whenever he wanted to. He had years ahead of him at school, after all. Thank you. Severus just shook his head, lowering his hand. No thanks necessary, but you are welcome all the same. He paused. Are you hungry? Harry shrugged. Is that an affirmative answer? I don't know. Severus studied him for a moment with a furrowed brow. Come to the sitting room. Harry followed Severus out of the bedroom and found himself seated at the table, plied with tea, biscuits, and sandwiches. I am concerned, Severus began, running a finger along the handle of his teacup, that you are not quite in tune with your body's need for food. Harry squinted. What do you mean? I eat every day. You eat when food is made available to you, but I suspect that it does not occur to you to seek out food if you are hungry between meals. Harry took a sip of tea, unsure of what to say. Was Severus right? He hadn't noticed being hungry. Based on what you have told me, it is my understanding that you frequently went hungry as a child. Harry set down his cup a little too hard and some of the tea sloshed over the edges. "What does that matter?" he asked sharply. "I'm not going hungry now. Proper meals now do not erase the impact of deprivation when you were younger." Harry frowned at his plate, biting down on his lower lip. What does he want from me? This is not intended as a criticism. Harry's eyes darted upwards. What is it supposed to be, then? Severus, forehead creased. An observation, I suppose, rooted in concern. Harry took a pointed bite of a biscuit. "I'm not going to die of starvation." He swallowed. "And it's not like you." He cut himself off before saying something he'd regret, but by the look on Severus' face, the man had a good idea of what Harry had intended to say. "Well, it's true. He's not exactly the picture of vitality." Severus was plenty thin himself, and it was like he hadn't even heard of the sun. Harry shoved the rest of the biscuit in his mouth to stop himself from talking. "It is something to keep an eye on, I suppose," Severus said. "Other thing, you mean?" Harry muttered with his mouth full. "Yes." Harry jerked up his head at Severus' sharp tone, swallowing too quickly. "I will not apologize for looking after your best interests." Severus straightened up, his mouth tightening into a thin line. "Even if, by doing so, our interactions may frequently end with tufts of both our hair scattered across the floor." An unwitting snicker forced its way out of Harry's mouth at that mental image, and his shoulders relaxed despite himself. "I wasn't starved, you know," Harry felt the need to say. "It was just they mostly just didn't let me have as much as I wanted, or if I did magic, they wouldn't let me have meals sometimes." Severus stared at Harry for a long moment, his gaze unnervingly focused. "You are aware," he said slowly, "that withholding nutrition is a highly inappropriate form of discipline, even if you had done something to warrant correction." Harry dropped his eyes and shrugged. "It was better than—" His voice trailed off, and he stared at his half-full teacup, then jumped when it began rattling. Had he lost control of his magic again? His head shot up, and he was even more startled to see Severus, jaw clenched and his fingers clutching the table edges so tightly his fingers were white. The rattling was Severus' magic. The man drew several deep breaths and closed his eyes, the rattling slowly dying away. "My apologies," Severus said in a tight voice. Was he apologizing for losing control of his magic, however briefly, or was he apologizing for something else, for Harry not being fed enough? But that hadn't been his fault. Harry opted not to respond, instead selecting a cucumber sandwich and nibbling on the edges of it. He set down his sandwich when Snape drew a breath. "There is nothing," the man began in a controlled tone. "That infuriates me more than the manner in which you were treated in that house." Harry let out a sigh, the lingering agitation he'd been feeling in response to the subject draining away at the man's words. It was often hard to understand the intent behind Severus' attempts to correct Harry's behavior, even if it was as basic as how much he ate. With the Dursleys, there had never been much discussion of Harry's behavior or habits. Unless he'd done magic, it was impossible to know whether he'd been thrown in his cupboard because he'd actually done something wrong, or if they just wanted him out of the way. They never commented on his eating habits. They just occasionally shoved a plate in his direction and made him feel like the little they gave him was asking too much. But Severus had made the room shake because he was angry, not at Harry, but at people who had hurt Harry, and he wanted to make it better. Harry looked up at Severus, who had since calmed, but he had no notion of what to say. Thankfully, the man didn't seem to expect anything from him. After several moments of silence, bar the sound of chewing, Severus spoke again. "Have you given any thought as to what you might like to do for Christmas?" Harry glanced up from his biscuit-laden plate, confused, though relieved at the change of topic. "What do you mean?" Severus raised a sardonic eyebrow. "Shall I repeat the question in French?" "I'd prefer Welsh," Harry said, rolling his eyes. Severus' lips twitched in amusement. "I assume your befuddlement is a result of never having been asked such a question before." Harry shrugged. "Guess so. Haven't really thought about it." "I will tell you what I propose, and you are free to provide input," said Severus. Harry nodded slowly. Why would Severus want his input? Harry had assumed they were going to stay at Hogwarts for the 2-week holiday, and he hadn't pictured Severus as the type to celebrate much of anything. "I imagine that the Hogwarts Christmas feast has more to offer in terms of entertainment," Severus' lip curled slightly, as though in disdain of anyone would seek entertainment, of all things, than what I can produce in my own home. He cleared his throat. After Christmas Day, we will spend the remainder of the holiday at home, as I believe a change of scenery would do us both a world of good." He clasped his hands together. "Are you amenable?" Sure." Severus continued, just watching him, and Harry added, "It would be nice to get out of here for a bit." Severus seemed oddly intent on Harry providing some sort of input, never mind that Harry didn't have much to say. Severus rubbed his forehead. "I must say, I have no experience in providing any sort of excitement that most children seem to crave at this time of year." "Oh, he doesn't know what to do here any more than I do." Harry gave a half smile. "It's all fine with me. There's nothing specific that I was expecting." "Very well." They went quiet again, and Harry absent-mindedly fiddled with the biscuit crumbs on his plate. "Do lots of people stay at Hogwarts for Christmas?" he asked. Snape shook his head. "Only a minority of students do. Thank Merlin." Harry snorted. The next weeks passed by without much incident, and somehow it was mere days before the start of the holidays. The grounds were covered in several feet of snow, and the lake frozen solid. Most students had taken to wearing cloaks and gloves in the corridors as they trekked through the drafty castle, though the cold didn't seem to be stopping people from romping around in the snow and skating on the lake. Padma had made it her business to teach everyone how to figure skate, and Harry was just glad he managed to keep his feet and not fall flat on his face like Michael kept doing. Lisa straight up refused to set foot on the ice altogether, claiming that it wouldn't withstand their weight and they'd all sink through and get eaten by the giant squid. "I do feel so sorry," Malfoy said loudly at breakfast the day before Christmas Eve, "for all those people who have to stay at Hogwarts for Christmas because they're not wanted at home." Harry wouldn't have noticed what Malfoy had said if not for Snape stalking towards the boy, looking incredibly pissed off. Had Malfoy been directing that comment at Harry? Well, that would be stupid, considering that Harry actually did have a home to go to. Still, it was a rather cruel thing to say where everyone could hear, as there might have been other students who didn't have a place to go. Chanukah was earlier in the month, Anthony was saying. "So we're going to have a sort of second Chanukah when my sister and I get home." "Is anyone staying here for the holidays?" Padma asked. The ceiling of the great hall suddenly darkened, in reflection of the sky outside, which had clouded over quite abruptly. Harry shivered, though the great hall was as warm as ever. "Strange. I'll be here for a few days," Harry offered, mostly in an attempt to distract himself. "Oh, are you? I'll have to make sure our family owl knows to find you here to bring your gift." Harry froze. Gift. She was planning to send him a gift, was everyone. It hadn't even occurred to Harry that he'd receive anything, and he certainly hadn't purchased anything for them. Maybe there's a way to order things from Hogsmeade. If magic hasn't figured out a way to do that, what's even the point of it? Severus would probably know. Harry could only hope that he'd manage to pull something together in time for Christmas, or he'd look like the worst sort of person. Why did this seem so obvious to everyone else? Harry kept one eye on Severus for the rest of the meal, and the moment the man got up and made for the exit, Harry hurried after him. "I think I'm the only one who didn't buy Christmas presents for everyone, and I'm going to look like I." Severus turned around by the doors of the great hall. "Harry, take a breath." Harry snapped his mouth shut and inhaled through his nose. "I took a breath, Happy." Severus rolled his eyes. "Ecstatic. Walk with me. I've a lesson to prepare." Harry matched Severus, quickening stride. "Is there any way to order gifts in time for Christmas? How was I supposed to know? I'm certain your friends will think nothing of it if they don't receive gifts from you." Harry scoffed, nearly tripping over his laces as he hurried to keep up with Severus. He shoved his hands in his pockets when they entered the dungeons to shield them from the chill. "Well, what am I supposed to get for them?" Severus didn't speak until they were seated in his office, and he began sorting through a pile of parchment. "I suggest you consider your friends' varied interests and purchase gifts most suited to them," he said, glancing up briefly. Harry sunk into the sofa, chewing on his lower lip. Sue liked Quidditch, as did Ron, so maybe he should get them Quidditch gear. He couldn't exactly buy Ron a broom, and Sue already seemed to have her own stuff. Hermione was an easy one. He'd just have to make sure to get her a book she didn't already have. Anthony, not as easy. He had a lot of interests, but they seemed to vary by the day. He and Padma had been into gobstones as of late. Did they have their own sets? Should he get something for Neville? Neville liked plants, but that would be a strange gift, wouldn't it? And Severus, he'd have to get a gift for him. But what could Harry possibly give the man that he'd be remotely interested in? As far as Harry knew, Severus. interests lay primarily in potions, books, and research. It wasn't as though he could give him potions ingredients. After a long while lost in thought, Harry scrawled out a list of passable gifts, letting out a long, slow breath when he finished. And it occurred to him then that gift-giving being a cause for stress wasn't much of a bad thing. Christmas was coming, and for the first time in his life, that meant something. Chapter 45. As Christmases Go. Chapter text, "It's Christmas today," said Jade, resting her back against the tree trunk. "I only remembered because Ed is off from work, and he went to the pub." Harry dropped a handful of snow on the ground, his ungloved fingers too cold for him to complete his attempt at a snowball. "Dudley got 32 presents," he said. "He was supposed to wait until morning to open them, but he went at them last night when they got home." "I think I got a present when I was little," said Jade. "I remember there were lots of candles lit, but I don't remember what the present was." She took a long breath through her nose. The room smelled like fried food. Harry shrugged. "I never got anything." "You probably did when you were a baby," Jade countered. Harry shrugged again. "What does a baby need a present for?" "Gifts are for the giver," Jade said sagely. Harry gave her an incredulous look. "What are you on about?" Jade started snickering then. "Not a bloody clue." "Heard someone say it on a TV program." Harry laughed aloud. As Christmases went, this wasn't a bad one. A strange sort of pressure on Harry's earlobe dragged him out of his sleep, and he opened his eyes, squinting. Where was he? This wasn't his dormitory, but, oh, it was the bedroom in Severus' quarters, his bedroom, and Hedwig was perched on his pillow, pecking at his ear. Yawning, Harry pushed himself up onto his elbow, and his jaw went slack, and he saw the large pile of wrapped parcels at the foot of his bed. It took him a ridiculously long time to process exactly what they were, why they were there, and that he hadn't imagined waking up in his own bedroom and had instead awoken in an abandoned warehouse. Are all these for me? There had to have been some sort of mistake. Did he even know that many people, let alone people who liked him enough to send presents? With an audible exhale, Harry clambered onto his hands and knees and sorted through the pile. Every single one was addressed to him. Among the senders were Sue, Anthony, Hermione, Padma, Ron, Molly Weasley, Ron's mother, Neville, Lisa. Harry sat there for a while, blinking stupidly. Hedwig pecked his ear again. All right, Harry murmured, stroking his finger over the top of her head. He reached for the closest gift, Ron's, and tore off the paper to find a pair of leather Quidditch gloves. A scrap of parchment fell out from the inside of one of them, which read, in an overlarge, messy scrawl, "I figured you didn't have any of your own, or else you would have used them. They were mine when I was younger, so they're not new or anything, but Hermione taught me a charm to make them look shiny. Merry Christmas." Harry grinned widely, his face feeling flushed. He'd purchased a chess set for Ron, which hopefully the boy would appreciate. For Sue, he'd sent a special edition of Quidditch through the ages that displayed the moving pictures in three-dimensional images upon touch. When he opened her gift, a warm, unidentifiable feeling rose up in his chest when he read the accompanying manual of the intricately designed wooden box of assorted tea bags, all made from various magical plants native to China, which promoted calmness, tranquility, and restfulness. Her note simply said, "You deserve peace. Merry Christmas." He stared at the box for a long while, blinking back a wetness in his eyes that was definitely not tears, his finger tracing the flowery engravings in the wood, before finally setting it aside carefully and reaching for the next gift. Unsurprisingly, Hermione had sent him a book called Transfigurations for the Overactive Mind. Apparently, Harry's struggles in Transfiguration hadn't been lost on her. He just hoped Hermione would find the book he'd sent her about ancient wizarding history in Britain equally useful, as they certainly weren't getting that information from Professor Binns. The package from Ron's mother was soft and lumpy, and it turned out to be a blue, hand-knitted sweater with the letter H on the front in bronze, along with a tin of homemade fudge that tasted wonderfully rich when he dipped a finger into it. The sweater felt impossibly warm when he pulled it over his head, and he wouldn't have been surprised if there was some sort of magic weaved into the threads to make it so. Why would she send me a gift? She doesn't even know me. Perhaps Ron had mentioned Harry to his mother. Still, it was rather odd, but Harry certainly wasn't going to complain. Harry made short work of opening the remaining gifts. Anthony had sent him a plethora of both magical and muggle sweets. Padma a set of high-quality quills. Lisa an intriguing-looking book about notable historical figures who were believed to be wizards and witches. And conversely, people who the wizarding community wanted to be magical but were actually muggles. And a Neville, a box of treacle-flavored chocolate truffles, of which Harry ate 2 in short order. Harry hadn't quite sent Neville a plant, but he'd managed to find a book in the Flourish and Blot's catalogue called Secrets of the Seeds, which listed little-known properties of relatively common magical plants, which he figured Neville might find useful. The most unexpected gift, which Harry hadn't noticed at first, as it was just an envelope buried under all the packages, was from Blaise Zabini, who'd sent him briefly worded instructions on how to perform the latest spell his relative had developed. At a quick glance, it was designed to alert the caster the moment another human approached within a certain distance. Harry would have to find a way to return the favor, as it hadn't occurred to him that the boy would send him a gift. Harry wasn't entirely sure how to classify his association with Zabini. They weren't even on first-name terms, and they'd only spoken a few times during herbology since they'd met in the dungeons that night. After setting his gifts carefully on his desk, Harry dressed quickly, then reached into the drawer in his bedside table for the one final gift he hadn't yet given. "Good morning," Severus said, when Harry entered the sitting room. The man was seated at the circular table nursing a steaming mug. Harry paused a few paces away, suddenly shy, and pressed the small, wrapped gift against his chest. What if he doesn't like it? What if he thinks it's stupid? Harry took a deep breath and walked forward to sit across from Severus. Yes, Severus asked mildly, taking a sip of tea. Harry opened his mouth, then closed it in favor of pushing the gift across the table right in front of Severus' plate. He set his gaze determinately towards the full English breakfast on the table and began to serve himself. He could hear Severus tearing open the parcel paper, and his heart started pounding when the sound stopped and the man didn't immediately speak. He hates it. I messed it up and now he'll think, Harry. Severus cleared his throat, and Harry couldn't help but glance up to meet his guardian's gaze. The man's brow was furrowed, and he seemed to be at a loss for words. Had Severus ever been at a loss for words in his life? Harry jumped a little when Severus reached across the table to cover Harry's hand with his own. "Thank you, Harry," he said. "I did not expect you were in no way obligated to gift me with anything." He ran his finger across the dragon-hide journal with the words, "To SS from HP" inscribed on the cover in silver. The shop Harry had ordered it from had claimed it would only open at the touch of the first person who opened it, and judging by the way Severus deliberately pressed his fingertip against the cover before opening it, he seemed to realize that. "This was very thoughtful of you, and much appreciated." Harry let out a breath and offered a tentative smile. I didn't think you expected it, but I wanted to give you something." Severus smiled widely enough for it to reach his eyes, and the sight of it set off a warm, fond feeling that settled over Harry like a warm cloak. "Very well done. I shall make good use of this." He slid the journal into an inner pocket of his robes, then produced a very small, wrapped box. "This is my gift to you, and I hope you will put it to good use as well." With a murmured thanks, Harry carefully unwrapped the package and opened the box to find a gleaming golden snitch. He stared up at Severus, wide-eyed. Is it a real snitch?" Severus nodded. "I imagine it will assist you in your goal to become a seeker." Harry smiled widely, knowing how Severus disapproved of the dangers of the position, but was still willing to help Harry pursue his goal, regardless. Severus shook his head in mock exasperation. They finished breakfast in companionable silence, and Harry settled on the couch to start on the book Hermione had given him. Severus was reading too, and occasionally jotting down notes in the margins. The hearty fire kept the room pleasantly warm, and Harry was in no rush to exit into the drafty corridors of the dungeons. It was still early. Perhaps he'd try out his new snitch later. "Did you stay at Hogwarts for Christmas when you were a student?" Harry asked, glancing up from his book. Severus looked up, his forehead wrinkling, and Harry immediately regretted asking. He opened his mouth to retract the question, but he swallowed his words when Severus spoke. "I did 3 times," he said. "The first was in my 5th year, after I'd had a falling out with my father during the summer. I stayed at Hogwarts the following 2 years as well." "Falling out?" Harry asked very quietly. Severus' eyes seemed to go flat. My mother had died earlier that year, and I blamed him for her death. Harry's breath caught in his chest. He did not kill her in the way you mean, Severus said. My view of her passing was that it was a death of 1,000 cuts. Harry swallowed. What did he do? Severus closed his eyes briefly. It was what he had once done, and later what he did not do. Did he hurt you? Harry knew the answer before he finished asking the question. It was quite obvious, really, and he supposed a part of him had known for some time that Severus shared some of Harry's experiences with violent guardians. Severus let out a harsh breath. On occasion, he was quite the violent drunk, though my mother received the brunt of his rages once I began attending Hogwarts. There were so many questions Harry wanted to ask. Did his father hate magic? If his mother was a witch, why couldn't she protect herself and Severus? But he swallowed them down. Severus would not want to be questioned relentlessly about such painful topics, not any more than Harry would. Where did you go after you left home? Harry opted to ask instead. Severus paused for a few beats before answering. I was taken in by Abraxas Malfoy, the grandfather of Draco Malfoy, until my coming of age. Harry stared. Were you close with them? Severus gave a mirthless sort of smile. Hardly. I was viewed as a good investment for the Dark Lord's cause. Harry bit his lip. Is that part of the reason you— I will not deny it, Severus said flatly. I had been treading a dangerous path for some time before then, although their influence certainly played a part. So that's how you know Malfoy? Harry asked. Severus nodded shortly. I felt a level of gratitude towards Abraxas, even with full awareness that I was simply a means to an end. And for some time, the debt I felt I owed to him extended to his son, Lucius, and his family. But you don't feel that way anymore. Severus stared at Harry for a long moment. I do not. I care very little for what Lucius and Narcissa believe I owe to them. My conscience stands clear on that front. What did Severus mean by that? Harry was tempted to ask, but Severus seemed to be done with the conversation and had turned back to his book. Harry followed suit. It sounded like Dudley was squealing in delight over one of the many Christmas presents he'd received. Or was he throwing a tantrum? It was hard to tell, locked in the cupboard under the stairs. Not that Harry couldn't have picked it, but Aunt Marge was here, and Harry would have preferred to stay locked in for a week over having to deal with her. She always paid a lot more attention to Harry than Vernon and Petunia did, and not in a good way. Harry pulled his blanket over his head to muffle the noise and flipped the page of his book, words lit by the unnatural glow of his threadbare bedsheets. He'd somehow managed to make objects glow in the dark at will with his magical powers, or whatever the hell they were. It was most convenient to light up the sheets while reading since it kept his hands free. Perhaps he could extend this strange ability to the wood of the treehouse. Maybe later, when the Dursleys left, he could go meet Jade. No, he couldn't. Because she was gone, and had been so for weeks now, but he kept forgetting. He kept wanting to forget. What good was the treehouse without her? She was the one who had found it first. Wherever you are, I hope you got lots of presents, Harry murmured under his breath, as though she could hear him, as though anyone cared about anything he had to say. Dudley shrieked again, and a booming laugh rang out, sounded like Aunt Marge. Then her dog barked. Harry wasn't sure which one she'd brought this time, as he'd been locked away since before she arrived. Who cared anyway? Who cared about presents? Who cared about Christmas? It was only for families, and Harry had no family. Harry turned to the next page in his book, because he didn't care at all. Harry could almost count on his fingers the number of Ravenclaw students that had remained at Hogwarts for Christmas, judging by the sparsely populated benches at the Ravenclaw table. It was a bit excessive, really, how much food had been laid out for the feast when there were all of 15 other students at the table. None of them were in Harry's year, either. There was a pair of second-year girls several feet away, a few third and fourth years, and the rest were all older students likely staying to get a head start on studying for their OWLS and NEWT, as the food was a lot more interesting to observe. Huge, roasted turkeys that looked miles better than the dry, shriveled dish Petunia had never allowed Harry to taste, crispy potatoes, silver boats of thick, rich gravy and cranberry sauce. The hall itself looked spectacular, almost dizzyingly so, with hundreds of candles floating in midair near the ceiling, glittering trees at every corner, and wreaths of holly and mistletoe hung around the walls. What was most mesmerizing was how the light of the candles reflected off of the fake snow falling from the ceiling, glinting in every color of the rainbow. Severus was seated at the high table beside Lupin, looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Lupin, though clearly tired, seemed in good spirits, and was chatting to the Care of Magical Creatures professor, who was missing multiple limbs. Harry nearly knocked over his mug of spiced apple cider when the Weasley twins materialized on either side of him. "We've noticed you're eating all alone, and we just can't have that," said probably Fred, draping an arm around Harry's shoulders. Harry rolled his eyes, shrugging off Fred's arm. "Did you hear me complaining?" "Oh, but you didn't have to." Without so much as a by your leave, the two of them hoisted Harry to his feet. "Join us." Grumbling under his breath, Harry allowed the twins to drag him over to the Gryffindor table without much protest, and he was deposited in a seat across from Ron. "Sorry about them," said Ron, glaring at the twins' retreating backs, who had evidently gone to accost Percy. The prefect had previously been absorbed in a book, but was now unsuccessfully trying to fight off the twins, who were yanking a sweater over his head. Harry shrugged, bemused more than anything, and filled an empty mug with the cider he'd been so rudely dragged away from. "Why are you here for the holidays?" "Mum and Dad went to Romania to visit my brother Charlie," Ron said through a mouthful of buttered peas. "He's studying dragons there." There was a touch of hero worship in Ron's expression as he said it. "Your mum sent me a gift," Harry said, aiming for nonchalance. Ron's ears went red. "I mentioned we were friends, and she was all like that poor boy, no parents to send him gifts. I didn't mention Snape because I'm not exactly sure what he—" Ron's eyes darted towards Snape. "Anyway, she must have got it in her head to knit you a sweater. Sorry about that." Harry shook his head rapidly. "No, I like it. I was just surprised. She knits us all sweaters every year. And mine's always maroon." He pulled at a loose thread on his sweater, which had a large R knitted on the front. "Does she use a charm to make them so warm?" Harry asked. Ron furrowed his brow. Maybe." His eyes went a bit distant for a moment. That would explain a lot. They were soon distracted by the wide selection of desserts that began popping into existence, and Harry wasted no time in serving himself tiny portions of every available dish so he could taste everything. "Christmas, Harry," Hagrid's voice boomed from the high table. Harry glanced over to see a ruddy-faced Hagrid waving clumsily, looking as though he'd won too many drinks. "Come by me hut later, got summat fur, yeah." Harry waved back tentatively, biting his lip to keep from laughing. "Seen I come with you?" Ron asked, biting into a tot. "Never seen the inside of his hut." "Sure," Harry said, assuming he'll still be upright. He caught Ron's eye, and soon they were both nearly crying from laughter. Filled to the gills, they lazed about at the table for a while longer, occasionally snagging bits from the remaining dessert plates. Harry took distinct pleasure in sucking on sugar cubes, one thing he'd always dreamed of doing when he was younger, but had never dared to try. The twins eventually returned with Percy in tow, and George introduced Harry to wizard crackers, which went off with a loud blast and engulfed them in bluish smoke, within which appeared a sequined purple top hat and several live, white doves. Laughing, Harry batted at George's arms as he shoved the hat onto Harry's head, which was so overlarge it fell down to his shoulders. Later, Harry and Ron trekked through the snow in the slowly fading daylight, overly energized from all the sugar they'd consumed, and surprisingly, Hagrid was still awake and relatively steady when they arrived at his hut. "Harry and Ron, is it?" He showed them in and dumped 2 enormous cups of tea on the table. "Have a seat." The tea was a bit strong, and Harry didn't think to warn Ron away from the rock cakes until the boy nearly cracked a tooth on one of them. He set it gingerly on the table between 2 fingers. All the while, Fang was snoring away on Hagrid's bed. "Lazy old thing, sleeping the day away," Hagrid muttered, puttering around by the fireplace. "Anyway, here's what I wanted to give ye. Only finished its juice before the feast." He dug his hand through several of the pockets in his overcoat until he pulled a small, wooden object and set it down on the table in front of Harry. Harry leaned forward interestedly. It was a small hunk of wood that had been carved into the shape of what appeared to be a dragon, the details surprisingly intricate for something that had been carved by Hagrid's huge hands. Harry looked up at Hagrid, who was staring back with unconcealed trepidation. "Well, do ye like it?" he asked. "It's brilliant," Harry said. "You made it yourself." "That I did," said Hagrid proudly. "His name is Norbert." Ron let out a quickly stifled giggle. Harry grinned. "It's his great." "Always wanted a dragon," said Hagrid, his eyes growing wistful. Rare, though, and expensive as all get out. My brother Charlie works with dragons, Ron piped up. Maybe he could help. Ah, Charlie, I remember I.M. graduated a few years ago, didn't he? Always liked I.M., Hagrid cleared his throat. Sorry, Ron, if I'd known ye were Carmen, I'd have made some at fur ye too. It's all right, said Ron, waving his hand and nearly upending his teacup. They left soon after, finding that the sun had set and the wind had picked up significantly. He's cool, said Ron, shivering. A bit mad, but cool, hey? He darted forward suddenly, and Harry nearly tripped over his own feet in surprise. I think I just saw Scabbers. Where? Harry glanced around the ground, but it was hard to see in the dark. He lit his wand with a muttered lumos. I swear I just saw there, by that tree. Harry squinted towards the tree in question. Isn't that the Whomping Willow? He asked. But the branches stood still as statues, and Harry could just make out a brown, rat-like tail by the light of his wand before it vanished beneath the roots. Harry cautiously stepped closer to the tree, half expecting the branches to start swinging, and squinted at the base of the trunk. I think I see a gap between the roots. He crouched down to position himself for a better view, but Ron darted straight past him. Ron, wait! But Ron suddenly vanished with a yelp, his voice growing fainter and strangely echoey, as though he were in a tunnel. Then nothing. Harry stood frozen for a minute, with the futile hope that perhaps Ron would resurface. Would the branches start moving again? Even if they didn't, where had Ron disappeared to? He could have fallen into a well, for all Harry knew. Damn it, Harry muttered, and before he could lose his nerve, he ran towards the gap in the roots. Holding his wand out in front of him, he could see that the gap was actually an opening to what appeared to be a narrow, sloping tunnel. And like an idiot, down he went. It took Harry longer than he cared to admit to figure out why the streets were so empty. In this part of London, there were always people out and about, even in the middle of the night. The library had closed early, too, and it was lucky he'd managed to avoid the notice of the custodian before locking up. At least he had somewhere warm to stay for the night. But he got it in his head to climb to the roof of the library, which had a door leading up to it. It was flurrying lightly, though the roof had accumulated several centimeters of snow over the past few days. It was almost like a blanket, white and untouched, and Harry took care to line up his footprints as he walked closer to the edge to see the city. Fairy lights, wreaths, and evergreen trees dusted with snow stood at every corner, even though this street was mostly occupied by shops and office buildings. And in the distance, voices, singing familiar songs he'd heard every year since he could remember. Well, spending Christmas Eve alone on a rooftop was better than a cupboard. He could see the lights and the trees and the snow instead of imagining it, with a bird-eye view that showed more than anyone could see from a window. There was no one waiting for him outside a locked door, just waiting for an opportunity to beat him down, to make him feel like he didn't belong. The view so calmed Harry that he didn't even startle when a large, tawny owl fluttered over to land on his shoulder with no sound but a rustling of its wings. Odd. He hadn't ever seen an owl like this around these parts. He didn't see owls much at all, really. Strangest part, though, was that it had a small, yellowish scroll tied to its leg with a bit of twine. Harry didn't dare try to touch it for fear of scaring the owl away. Good thing, because it remained perched on his shoulder for a little while longer, its feathers soft and warm against the side of Harry's face. The owl then hooted softly in Harry's ear before taking off, flying away towards its destination. Harry's shoulder may have just been a detour, but it meant that he hadn't had to spend Christmas alone. As Christmases went, this could have been worse. Chapter 46. The Man with Three Faces. Chapter text. The slope was steep enough that Harry slid more than walked his way down, and he couldn't prevent himself from falling to his hands and knees when he reached the bottom. He hopped to his feet, steadying his wand, and followed the only pathway forward. It seemed endless, twisting and turning so frequently that he was beginning to feel dizzy. He could hear faint, echoey footsteps somewhere ahead of him, but he knew better than to call out Ron's name. Anyone could be down here. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Why did I do this? I should have at least got some backup instead of jumping down here like a complete moron. But it was too late. Ron could be hurt, and it would take twice as long to go back now. And what if he got to the entrance only to find the Whomping Willow swinging its branches in full force? So Harry continued to follow the passageway, lit only by his wand, his heart beating so quickly he could hear it thumping in his ears. Or maybe because it was so eerily quiet, the distant footsteps having since abated. Eventually, the tunnel began to rise in a steep upward slope, then twisted sharply at the end, stopping just before a small opening. Harry hesitated for a brief moment, then raised his wand higher so he could see what lay beyond. The first thing he noticed was a shock of red hair glowing fire-like by the light of his wand. Ron, lying motionless on the ground, his arms and legs splayed out limply. "Don't be dead, don't be dead." Harry rushed over and dropped to his knees, barely noticing the pain of the impact, his sweaty, fumbling fingers searching his friend's neck for a pulse. It took a few moments to find it, but his fingers finally brushed against the right spot. Weak, slightly irregular, but undeniably there. Harry's breath released itself in a long whoosh, and he shifted backwards to look around the room properly, climbing to his feet as he did. It appeared as though it had been uninhabited for a very long period of time. Very dusty, with scratched, peeling paint on the walls, and a general air of neglect. The windows were all boarded up with uneven slabs of wood, also riddled with scratch marks. There were dark stains all over the floor, too, and broken furniture that looked as though it had been deliberately smashed. A small wooden table cracked down the middle, scattered, splintered chair legs, an empty cupboard with no doors. The only thing that was in one piece was a sagging, filthy sofa with most of its stuffing ripped out. Yet there was one thing that didn't look old or neglected. A wand, lying a few feet away from where Ron lay. Is that Ron's wand? But Harry knew the answer to that. It was noticeably shorter than Ron's, and an entirely different shade. Plus, it lacked the white, glinting spot at the top that Ron claimed was a bit of unicorn hair poking out. Harry's heart rate sped up again, and he held his wand up to chest level. The most likely scenario was that someone had knocked Ron out and fled. But why would they have left their wand behind? He stood motionless for several moments, and was considering going back to the castle for help, whooping willow or not, when a rustling noise broke the silence. Harry stumbled back a few steps, biting back a gasp. The rustling started up again, and he tried his best to follow the sound with the light of his wand to find Scabbers. The rat was scurrying back and forth across the floor in a strange, irregular pattern. It paused next to Ron for a moment, then darted out of sight into a darkened corner of the room. Biting back a nervous laugh, Harry exhaled slowly. Here he was, panicking over a rat, never mind that the little creature was the reason he was in this predicament in the first place. It was just a rodent, after all. Whoever had left their wand behind was probably long gone by now, so maybe he should. Harry jumped in surprise when Scabbers scurried back into sight, until he was just inches away from Harry's feet. He stopped in place then, and started shaking as though he were having some sort of seizure. Harry stared in grim fascination, unsure of what to do, when the rat began to change. It seemed to be growing larger, the tail and hair receding, its form expanding from every edge, until Harry's wand hit the floor with a clatter when a fully grown man stood in the very place Scabbers had just been. The man was very short, not much taller than Harry, with uneven tufts of colorless hair that looked as though it had been hastily shorn off, a pointed nose, and small, pale eyes, which darted nervously back and forth before settling on Harry. It was then that a familiar, burning pain began to build up in Harry's scar. You look just like James," the man said in a squeaky voice, his eyes growing rounder. He stepped forward, but stopped when Harry stumbled back, fishing through his pockets for his wand, which he belatedly realized he'd dropped on the floor. "I never meant to. You weren't supposed to come down here." Harry just stared, at an utter loss for words. Who was this man? How did he know Harry's father? How had he? Had he been Scabbers all along? Was he an animagus? Did Ron know about this? The pain in his scar was worsening by the moment, but his utter shock at the situation was doing a fairly good job of masking it. "Who are you?" Harry managed, his voice trembling slightly. He crouched down to grab his wand, not taking his eyes off the man for a moment. The man's eyes darted away, his shoulders hunching anxiously. That doesn't matter." His voice broke off when a sudden hissing noise emerged from somewhere close by, and his face was overtaken by what could only be described as sheer terror. Harry's scar burned yet more fiercely, so much so that he bit back a gasp and pressed his palm against it. "Let me see him," the strange, hissing voice said. But he's not, you shouldn't. Turn around, Peter. The man, Peter, whimpered, then slowly turned around with his eyes squeezed shut. And Harry darted backwards so rapidly his back slammed into the wall when he was met with a face jutting out of the back of Peter's head. "Harry Potter," it said, lips stretching into an eerie sneer. The face was chalk-white, lips so thin they were nearly non-existent, with slits for nostrils like a snake and glowing red eyes, eyes that had haunted Harry's dreams. "Voldemort," Harry breathed. The sneer grew wider. "Yes, I did not expect to be so fortunate as to meet you now so soon. Serendipitous, I should say." Harry's heart was pounding so rapidly, his breath so hard to come by, that he thought he might pass out. "Keep it together. Why would you want to meet me?" Harry asked in as steady a voice as he could manage, his back still pressed against the wall. "Why, Harry, you fascinate me," the face said. Harry dropped his eyes, just slightly, away from the bizarre sight, but that only drew his attention to the way Peter Pettigrew's body was positioned, feet facing in the opposite direction of Voldemort's face. It made him shudder, and he didn't know which sight was harder to rest his gaze upon. "I have been watching you since you arrived at school, though my observations were unfortunately cut short when Quirrell proved to be even more useless than Peter here." "Quirrell?" Harry asked, his eyes darting back upwards in his surprise. "You mean you were possessing him too? Very good." Voldemort's red eyes gleamed brighter, and the pain in Harry's scar flared. "Severus will pay dearly for his little stunt. I count myself lucky that Peter here was on the premises, though as weak-minded as I've ever known him. He offered scarcely a struggle when I pursued him next." "What does that mean? What did Severus do?" "But you," Voldemort continued. "You remind me so much of myself when I was young, brimming with potential, powerful. You may well be worthy to stand by my side, instead of facing me in a duel you would have no hope of winning." Harry stared, a sliver of anger briefly overtaking his shock. "Why would I stand by your side?" he asked through teeth that were gritted, in one part pain and the other fury. "You killed my parents, and you tried to kill me." Voldemort just shook his head. "You fail to see the bigger picture, Harry," he said, as though they were discussing the current state of politics. "You fail to see the greatness that lies ahead of you. If only you could let go of all those useless sentiments. They will only hold you back." Harry opened his mouth, then closed it before he could say what he really thought, that he'd never join Voldemort in a million years, that he didn't care about greatness or power. But what use would it be? Voldemort seemed to be playing nice for now, but he wouldn't be likely to stay that way if Harry showed any signs of resistance. So he kept quiet, his grip tight on the handle of his wand, waiting for Voldemort to speak. But Voldemort did something worse than speak. He smiled, his lips curving grotesquely, and Harry had to fight not to avert his eyes. "You are clever, then," said Voldemort. "Not a Ravenclaw for nothing. You know which battles to choose, when to capitulate, and when to bow to the knowledge of your betters." He stepped closer, Peter's feet moving backwards, and Harry couldn't have backed away even if his limbs hadn't been frozen in place, considering that his back was against the wall, quite literally. "One day you will be the power to which wizard-kind will surrender." Voldemort turned to the side and stretched out a hand, or rather, Peter's hand. "Take my hand, and I will take you away from here." His voice lowered to a hiss. "I will teach you everything I know, and you and I, we will become great." Harry could barely breathe, and his chest felt as though it were being compressed in a narrow tube. What was he supposed to do? Even if he could outrun Voldemort, Ron was still lying unconscious on the floor. Voldemort had ignored the other boy so far, but what would stop him from killing Ron at the first opportunity? He didn't seem to want to kill Harry, at least not immediately, and if Harry let Voldemort apparate him away, Ron would at least be left alone. He'd have to wake up eventually, and he'd be able to find his way back. But Harry couldn't help cringing away when Voldemort drew closer. "Take him." Peter turned around to face Harry once again. The man's face was twitching, and he looked distinctly ill, as though he'd have preferred to be anywhere but where he was. Whatever concerns Peter might have didn't stop him from reaching out to Harry, and Harry instinctively reached back, shoving his hands against the man's face. And at the touch of Harry's fingers, Peter's face began to burn. The man screamed, his skin blistering as though Harry's hands were white-hot, and Harry yanked his hands back, turning them over to stare at his palms. But they looked and felt no different than normal. Peter reached for him again, and Harry pushed his hands back against his face. Peter howled at the contact, scrabbling uselessly at Harry's hands. But Harry didn't stop, desperate, nearly blinded by the pain in his scar, and kept it going until Peter fell to his knees, shrieking. Useless! Voldemort hissed, and Harry flinched backwards, letting go of Peter in his shock, when a strange gust of black smoke poured right out of the back of Peter's head, floating upwards until it disappeared. Harry stood there, his chest heaving and heart pounding as though he'd just run a mile at full speed. The pain in Harry's scar faded as quickly as it had come, and Peter was curled on the ground, whimpering faintly, looking as though he'd pass out at any moment. What do I do? Harry felt paralyzed, his feet rooted to the filthy wooden floor. What could he do? He didn't know any spells to wake Ron up, and he couldn't leave the boy here alone with Peter. The man wasn't dead, after all. If only he had Hedwig here to send a message, or a spell to do the same. There had to be something like that, and if he ever got out of here, he'd be sure to learn it at the first opportunity. But now, he was well and truly stuck. Enter. Severus narrowed his eyes at the two uncharacteristically somber-looking, red-headed twins who were approaching his desk at a rapid speed. Before he could so much as draw a breath to speak, one of them thrust a well-worn piece of parchment in his direction. We've been looking for ages, and we can't find them anywhere. They vanished somewhere in the passageway through the Whomping Willow, but we don't know how they could have got in, and we don't know where it leads to. Silence. They both snapped their mouths shut, and Severus noticed then how frightened they seemed. Who precisely are you unable to find? Severus asked in a carefully modulated tone, turning the parchment in his hands. Ron and Harry. Severus felt as though his entire body had been submerged in ice. Harry was missing. Harry. He could not lose the boy. He'd sooner die. He roughly unfolded the parchment, nearly ripping it in the process, and straightened it to find green, curly words emblazoned at the top, which read Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, purveyors of aids to magical mischief-makers, are proud to present the Marauder's map. Severus needed no more information. He slashed his wand through the air to produce a familiar, silvery doe and spoke his message, sending it straight towards Lupin. The man rushed it, moments later, breathing hard and clutching his chest. He looked ever rangier than usual, his face so pale it was nearly translucent. The full moon had been just a few days ago, Severus remembered, but as it was due to his brewing skills that the blasted man was even standing so soon after his transformation, Severus did not hesitate to stride towards him and thrust the map into his hands before Lupin managed to catch his breath. The passageway, through the Whomping Willow. Where does it go? Where does it go? The shrieking shack. The words emerged quietly and slightly hoarse, but Lupin may as well have spoken them through a loudspeaker. Severus was running, out of his office and down the corridor with Lupin hurrying behind him. Please stay in the castle, boys, Lupin was saying to the Weasley twins. We'll bring them back safe. But, sir, he's our brother, we can't. With a snarl, Severus swung around and pointed his wand at the boys. You will do as you were told, or I will stun you and have you levitated to your dormitories. The boys did not quail, as Severus had hoped, but they did stop walking. Please bring them back, sir, one of them said, a faint quiver lacing his tone. Severus heaved a breath, lowering his wand. I will die trying. With that, he strode off towards the Whomping Willow, Lupin at his heels. When he reached it, the branches were swinging as wildly as ever, but Severus knew well what to do. How could he forget? He shot a quick stunning spell at the small knot as the base of the tree and darted through the frozen branches towards the opening. As though no time had passed at all since that ill-fated day, he'd been daft enough to give in to Black's taunts and chase after a werewolf, who was currently following him, near silently. Severus, of course, had never made it to the end of the passageway, Potter having stopped him halfway through, so he unfortunately needed Lupin available in the event that he required assistance finding the end of it. The walk seemed endless, and the low-ceilinged passageway forcing the men to walk bent, nearly double, only slowed them down further. Never before had Severus, prowess in occlumency, failed to clear his thoughts and numb his emotions enough for him to move forward, to complete his tasks, however unpleasant, however horrifying, however much he'd nearly rather be dead than take another step. But now he might as well have been 11 years old again, his mind and emotions wide open and vulnerable, free for the taking, free for the feeling. If Harry was not at the end of this passageway, alive and intact, if he was gone, if he was dead, no amount of occlumency could shield Severus from the consequences of that, from the pain, from the rage that would burn through him until nothing but ashes remained. And he'd be glad for it, because it would be better than having to live with what it would mean if Harry were gone. When they reached the opening at the end of the passageway, it felt as though Severus had been walking for hours along the precipice between life and death, between the before and the after. But then Severus saw the back of Harry's head, the back of an alive, upright Harry, and all time stopped. He grabbed Harry's shoulders and spun him around to pull the boy close against his chest. Harry flinched at the contact at first, but his resistance subsided quickly, his fists latching onto Severus' robes. Severus could not speak for several moments. He could barely breathe, and the child he was clutching against him, the warm, breathing, trembling child, was the only thing he could see. "What on earth possessed you to come down here?" Severus hissed when his breath came back to him, squeezing the child more tightly. Harry shuddered in his arms. I didn't ran after Scabbers, but it wasn't really Scabbers, and I didn't know what to do and my hands, they Peter. Both Severus and Harry glanced up at Lupin's voice. Harry squirmed out of Severus' embrace and tried to take a step forward, but was held in place by a firm grip on his arms. "Remus," moaned the quivering, blistered man on the floor that Severus had only just noticed. How Lupin broke off, seemingly at an utter loss for words. "I thought you were dead, Peter." "All these years, please understand, Remus," the man who Severus now recognized as Peter Pettigrew croaked, though it was a wonder Severus could tell, with his face so badly burned. "I had no choice. I had to the Dark Lord. He would have killed me." Lupin crouched down and leaned closer to Pettigrew. "Sirius is in prison for killing you and 12 muggles. If he did not kill you—" "I had no choice," Pettigrew said again, gasping, as he curled onto his side. "It was me or him. You know you would have." He shut his mouth, quailing, when Lupin held up a hand. "All this time, we all believed, that Sirius had been the traitor. But it was you. You let him take the fall for you and played dead like the coward you are." "What's going on?" Harry whispered to Severus in a shaky voice, and Severus realized he was a horribly negligent guardian, because Harry was immensely pale and trembling violently. Severus pulled the boy back into his arms. "I'm taking you back to the castle," he said shortly. But what about Ron?" Severus glanced at the unconscious boy on the floor, furrowing his brow at his failing observational skills, and knelt down beside him, keeping one hand on Harry. "Renovate." After a moment, the Weasley boy slowly opened his eyes and let out a moan. He certainly wasn't going to be walking any time soon. Severus glanced at Lupin, who was still gaping wordlessly at a sobbing Pettigrew, and then at Harry. "Can you walk?" he asked Harry. "Yes," the boy said quickly. "Ron needs the hospital wing. Can you—" Severus pointed his wand at the Weasley boy to render him weightless, and with one arm he swung the boy over his shoulder, and with the other he grabbed Harry's upper arm. "I trust you will see to this situation," he said over his shoulder as he made his way to the door. Lupin straightened up, his shark-dulled eyes meeting Severus. "Of course, I'll contact Albus and we'll—" Severus ignored the rest of the man's sentence and pulled Harry close, gripped the Weasley boy firmly, and apparated to the edge of the Hogwarts grounds. He walked towards the castle silently, his grip firm on Harry's arm, and he had to take care to slow his stride enough for Harry to keep up. Halfway across the grounds, his path was interrupted by the Weasley twins sprinting towards him. "Do you have him?" "Is Ron okay?" Severus hefted the boy off his shoulder, who was still feather-light, and set him in one of the twins' outstretched arms. "Take him to the hospital wing," he barked. "I trust you can manage that task without supervision." "Of course, sir, thank you." But Severus was stalking off once again, Harry in tow. Chapter 47. No one but you. Chapter text. I don't want it. Do I look as though I care? Do I look like I care? Harry snapped back, scowling. "I don't want a calming draft. It'll make me fuzzy, and you still haven't explained anything, and I already told you what happened. You're shaking like a leaf," Severus said sharply. "Your pupils are dilated, your face is pale, and it's past 1 in the morning." Harry folded his arms, digging himself into the back of the sofa. Severus gazed back stonily for several moments, then rolled his eyes skyward and lifted his hands, as though he'd given up. "If I give you an explanation, will you take the damned potion? It's not spiked with any other draught that will put you to sleep." Harry blew out a breath. "Fine," he groused, plucking the vial out of Severus' proffered hand and downing it in one gulp. The effect was almost immediate. Muscles that Harry hadn't even noticed were tense loosened, the beginnings of a tension headache around his temples faded, and the faint churning in his stomach disappeared. He still managed to glare at Severus, but it was half-hearted at best, and the man responded with nothing more than a twitch of his eyebrow. He cleared his throat, eyeing Harry with an unnerving focus. "I supposed I'd be wasting my breath to point out how monumentally stupid it was of you two." "I know," Harry groaned, leaning his head against the sofa cushion. "It was dumb. I was an idiot. I should have come to you. How many detentions is it this time?" "None," Severus said, summoning Harry's blanket from his room and wrapping it around his shoulders. "I dare say the events of this evening have more effectively impressed upon you the consequences of your actions than any number of detentions I could assign." Harry bit his lip, his eyes darting away. When he thought about it, if he'd gone to find Severus, and the man had gone down to that abandoned house himself, Voldemort might very well have killed him. But perhaps this wasn't the best time to point that out. "Now," Severus said, "Lupin would be better suited to regale you with the full details of this incident and its background, but I will do my best to provide you with the information that I am privy to, much of which I was only just now made aware of." He eyed a rumpled scroll of parchment on his desk, which had appeared out of thin air shortly after they had arrived in Severus' sitting room. "Lupin saw fit to message me with the details, likely in the fear that I may have misunderstood the situation and might let something slip to the wrong person." His lip curled derisively, perhaps in his disgust at the thought that someone might assume he'd be so foolish. Severus cleared his throat. "Your father, Lupin, Sirius Black, and Peter Pettigrew were close friends during our school years." His face seemed to freeze over at that statement, his eyes hardening into an expression that Harry couldn't interpret. "Your father, Black, and Pettigrew all became animagi while at school, for reasons that I will leave to Lupin to disclose, and Pettigrew's form, of course, was a rat. Pettigrew said I looked like James. Like my father," Harry said quietly. "Yes," Severus said in a low voice. "You greatly resemble your father." He had a strange expression on his face, and his shoulders were drawn up tightly. Harry frowned. Was Severus upset by something? Was he angry? Harry shook off the thought when the man continued. "As I said, the four of them were close friends at school, and as far as I am aware, they remained so upon graduating, and they were all deeply involved in the resistance against the Dark Lord's regime." Harry could recall reading in a book, back in the summer, that his parents had been involved in the fight against Voldemort. Was that why they had been targeted? "When you were a baby, it was discovered that the Dark Lord was targeting your family," Severus said in response to Harry's unasked question. The man cleared his throat again, and he looked distinctly discomfited. "Have you heard of the Fidelius charm?" Harry shook his head, staring. "It is a powerful charm that hides a specified location within a single individual. When cast, all but that one person are magically prevented from sharing the location, and the chosen secret keeper alone can, willingly, divulge the location to whomever they wish." "This charm was performed on my parents' house?" Harry asked. Severus nodded gravely. "It was." He went quiet then, and he looked pained. "Albus himself offered to be their secret keeper, but your parents insisted on entrusting that duty to Sirius Black, your father's closest friend and confidant. When Lupin had spoken to Pettigrew, the man's sentences had been fractured and unclear, but Harry could clearly recall his words on this subject. All this time, I had believed, we all believed, that Sirius had been the traitor. But it was you. You let him take the fall for you, and played dead like the coward you are." "They didn't use Sirius, did they?" Harry said slowly. "They asked Peter to do it, and he betrayed them." Severus nodded shortly. "Yes, your parents chose to entrust Pettigrew with this task, and he betrayed them to the Dark Lord at the first opportunity. But why would Harry, cut himself off? Was there any need for an explanation aside from Peter being a traitor and a coward? Why did everyone think Sirius betrayed them, then, if he wasn't the secret keeper?" he asked instead. "I assume your parents thought it prudent that no one knew of the true secret keeper. A sound strategy, I should say, had Pettigrew been as trustworthy as they believed. So that's why Sirius Black is in prison, because people think he betrayed them to Val to you-know-who. Harry switched to the moniker when Severus tensed up at the first syllable. Not as such, Severus said flatly. He was convicted of murdering 13 people, 12 muggles and Pettigrew, whose death was confirmed by the presence of a single finger that matched his DNA. A single finger, a missing finger. Scabbers had a missing toe. I see you've worked it out, said Severus tiredly. For all his faults, Pettigrew was wily and perfectly willing to do whatever it took to save his own skin, even if it meant living as a rat for over a decade. Voldemort, Severus flinched as though the word had caused him physical pain, but Harry pressed on. He said that you would pay for what happened with Quirrell. He chewed his lip for a moment. Did you kill him? Severus inclined his head, watching Harry carefully, cautiously, as though expecting Harry to bolt in fear. Harry sunk himself deeper into the cushions of his seat in response. So Val, he was possessing Quirrell too, and that's why my scar hurt. Severus nodded again, his stance loosening. But how did my hands make Pettigrew burn? Severus frowned. I cannot say. I imagine Albus may be able to offer an insight on the matter. It was proving difficult for Harry to fully process the information he'd been given. Not to mention, his long, eventful evening was beginning to take effect, and his eyelids were feeling heavy. There is something else that you should know, Severus' voice washed over Harry like a breeze that made him feel even more sleepy. Something I must tell you. Harry's eyes drifted shut, and he knew no more. Severus studied Harry carefully as the boy buttered his toast across the table. By all appearances, he was fine, displaying no obvious anxiety in response to what had happened to him the previous night. There remained that ever-present tension in his posture, which Severus hoped would continue to fade with time and patience, but no undue fear or agitation. I could have lost him. Severus closed his eyes against the thought. The moment Harry finished his breakfast, he'd take the boy home, away from here and the danger that seemed to lurk at every corner. He kept a tight hold on Harry as they stood on the outside of the Hogwarts gates in preparation to disapparate, and he didn't let go when they arrived home, guiding the boy down the walkway and clearing the snow away from the path as they walked. To his credit, Harry didn't try to pull away, and Severus only released him when they entered the warmth of the house. The rest of the holiday passed peacefully. For Severus, this brief respite from the castle and his myriad duties felt nothing short of revitalizing, and Harry seemed to be doing as well as could possibly be expected. The child had made himself comfortable in his room, and Severus had even spotted him tiptoeing into the kitchen one night for a snack. Severus had kept himself out of sight, loath to startle the boy, but the fact that Harry felt secure enough to help himself unprompted was no small thing. Harry spent much of his time outdoors, playing with the snitch Severus had given him, and when the snowfall grew too heavy, he occupied himself in the library and occasionally joined Severus in the laboratory. But the morning, an unfamiliar owl dropped an envelope with loathsomely familiar writing scrawled across it right on top of his freshly buttered toast. Severus knew the reprieve was at an end. Chancing a quick glance at Harry, who appeared to be quite absorbed in chopping strawberries into tiny pieces with the precision he applied to his potions lessons, and mixing them into his porridge, Severus opened the envelope and unfolded the parchment. Dear Severus, it read, I do hope you're enjoying your time away, and that Harry is not too upset by the events that occurred on Christmas Day. With Albus, assistance, Peter was detained at Hogwarts until the Aurors arrived to interrogate him, at which time he immediately confessed and was swiftly removed to a holding cell to await his trial. Sirius was released with little fanfare, as I imagine the minister wants nothing less than the public catching wind of this monumental miscarriage of justice. Sirius was first checked into St. Mungo's, but he refused to stay. He has, shockingly, retained his sanity, which he claims is a result of his animagus ability. He is currently residing with me at my home, and he has frequently expressed his wish to see Harry. Of course, as Harry's legal guardian, the decision will be left up to you, but I have enclosed a letter Sirius has addressed to Harry, and I hope you will allow him to read it. A very Merry Christmas to you. Remus J. Lupin. Severus nearly set the parchment alight, along with the additional letter that remained in the envelope. He would have loved nothing more than to burn the words from existence, but he had no right to withhold the letter from Harry. He reached for the enclosed letter, if only to read it, and ensure that it wasn't some drivel-filled nonsense written by a half-insane ex-convict. But his hand froze over the envelope. That wasn't why he wanted to read it. Black is likely furious that I have custody of Harry. He would stop at nothing to smear my name, to turn Harry against me, and he has the facts in his favor. Black was well aware of the part Severus had played in the deaths of Lily and James Potter, in the orphaning of their son, and the only way Severus could possibly think to prevent Harry from learning of that information was to refuse to allow him to meet the thrice-damned dog or to correspond with him at all. But even if he were to stoop so low as to do that, who was to say that Harry would never learn of that information from another source? I have to tell him, and soon, but not just yet. Harry looked so peaceful just now, so unconcerned, and the skies were clear today. Surely the boy would want to fly, and how could Severus ruin that for him by burdening him with this information? It could wait, but not much longer. Harry did fly, taking advantage of the brief show of sunshine, and Severus threw frequent glances through the window until the boy landed, windswept and red-cheeked, looking as carefree as Severus had ever seen him. Severus had never thought he could feel greater regret for his actions than he had when he learned of Lily's death. But seeing Harry like this, and knowing he would soon have to burden him yet further, wiping away the rare spark of joy in his eyes, was more than Severus could bear. Harry seemed to pick up on Severus' melancholy state when they sat down for lunch, shooting him occasional glances with a questioning look, and Severus could not even bring himself to smooth over his own expression. He had no right to do that, to hide his regret from Harry, even if the boy didn't yet know what it was for. When the last vestiges of daylight faded away, Severus could postpone it no longer. "There is something we must discuss," he said to Harry from where he was sitting in the library. He had intentionally positioned himself here at this time, in the vague hope that the setting would offer the boy some semblance of calm. Harry glanced up, his shoulders straightening and his jaw setting, as though he knew that what Severus had to tell him was no trivial thing. "What I am about to disclose to you, you may find to be," Severus cleared his throat, dragging his chair closer. "This is in relation to what I have told you about your father and his friends, and the betrayal that led to their deaths." Harry nodded, his eyes wide and expectant. "You may wonder why the Dark Lord chose to target your family in particular." Severus couldn't help but avert his eyes, just for a moment, to gather himself and prepare for the worst. The very least he could do was look Harry in the eye in the moment he spoke the next words and accept the outcome, whatever it may be, with the full knowledge that it was his doing and no one else's that had led them both to this moment. There was a prophecy. A prophecy. What the boy quieted when Severus held up a hand. "You must understand that prophecies are by no means an indisputable prediction of the future. At best, they represent possible occurrences, most of which never come to pass. Yet there was one prophecy that pertained to your family and the Dark Lord, which the Dark Lord was informed of and opted to accept it as the unavoidable truth." What was the prediction? Severus took a sharp breath. The words were unclear, he lied. It was difficult to interpret their precise meaning, but they concerned your family, implying that it would be the key to the Dark Lord's defeat. Harry stared at Severus with a furrowed brow, and Severus was finding it quite difficult to maintain eye contact. He could not burden Harry with the full knowledge of the prophecy, not now, but he had never before found it so difficult to lie. "When the Dark Lord cursed you with intent to kill," he continued, nearly desperate to provide the boy with some part of the truth, "the spell rebounded upon him. Albus believes, with good reason, that it was your mother's doing. Her unwavering, wholehearted sacrifice for you imbued you with a protection that the Dark Lord could not encroach." Harry's eyes narrowed. Is that the same protection Dumbledore was talking about when he explained why he left me with the Dursleys? Severus nodded once. "You may wonder," he forced himself to say, "how exactly the Dark Lord was made aware of the prophecy that he put into action." Harry blinked at him, and Severus nearly shook with the effort it took not to look away. "It was my doing. I overheard the prophecy when it was first given, and as I was a willing servant of the Dark Lord at the time, I relayed it to him. I did not know it pertained to your family, but that does little to absolve me." He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and drew a long breath. "When I discovered that the Dark Lord believed it to speak of your family, your mother, I begged him to spare Lily, whom I still deeply cared for, despite our years-long estrangement by that point in time. As you can imagine, the Dark Lord paid no regard to my wishes. Severus kept his eyes closed for several minutes, hearing only the sound of Harry's steady breathing. He forced himself to open his eyes and meet Harry's. The boy looked. It was hard to say. He did not look furious, hateful, horrified as well he should have, but instead was staring with a lost expression on his face. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say," Harry finally said. "You're the only person to ever give a damn about what happens to me." He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Unless you're doing it to make up for," Severus straightened abruptly. "Oh, contraire. In fact, I had fully intended to despise your very existence for that reason." "Why?" The question was simple, and Harry had every reason to ask it. The boy might not have recognized the horridness of Severus, early maltreatment of him, far too accustomed to abuse by his guardians, but he knew better now. If he did not, every effort Severus had made to help the child along the path towards healing would have been for naught. Harry deserved the truth. He needed the truth. Severus blew out a breath. "In my mind, you were a symbol of the worst mistakes I had ever made. The child of the woman whose friendship I had ruined, and of the man I had hated with every fiber of my being, with whom I'd had a volatile relationship from the very first day we met in school. The child who I as good as orphaned by my own hand. I could not bear to even think of you, and when you were first placed in my care, I could scarcely stand to look at you and see what I had done." Severus swallowed thickly, the motion feeling painful. "But you made it impossible for me to hate you." Harry drew back, his jaw tightening. "What did my tragic life story make you pity me instead?" "No," Severus said sharply. "I grew to love you." Harry's eyes grew impossibly wide. "You don't?" "I do," Severus said in a quiet yet steely voice, for he had never been more certain of any words he'd spoken. "I knew it when I found you bleeding out on the bathroom floor tiles. I knew that I could not lose you, that I would watch the world burn for you, that I would kill for you, die for you, and in that moment I realized nothing mattered." Severus paused to inhale, having released all his breath in his need for this truth to be said. "Not my rivalry with your father, not the loss of my friendship with your mother, nor my wasteland of a childhood, my past regrets, or my doomed future, none of it mattered but you." He met Harry's eyes directly. "And know this." Severus' voice nearly failed him, pain that was nearly physical but not quite shooting through his chest, and he clenched his jaw in an attempt to keep the ache at bay. "Should you find that you cannot forgive me for what I have done, for the part I have played in your suffering, and you no longer wish to remain in my care, I will not stop loving you." The boy was shivering, and Severus reached over to lay his hands on Harry's shoulders before he could stop himself. The boy didn't shrug him off, but he didn't lean into the touch either, and was just staring, hardly blinking, his eyes suspiciously shiny. "Why tell me now?" Harry asked, his voice shaky. "Of my misdeeds or that I love you?" Harry lowered his eyes. "I dunno," he whispered. Severus sighed, releasing the boy's shoulders. "With Black's exoneration, it was only a matter of time. I believed that you needed to hear it from me. Lupin's discretion I felt I could rely upon, but not Black's. He wishes to meet you, and he would possibly tell you." Severus swallowed, and he'd be justified. He met Harry's eyes. "As for the latter, I suppose I feel that, should you wish to no longer associate with me after learning of this, I want you to know that you are loved." Harry did not sleep well that night. Upon Severus' revelation, Harry had retreated to his favorite tree and spent a while sitting on the highest branches, incognizant of the cold. Severus did not tell him to come inside, even though it was dark, and he only returned to the house when his fingers and toes went numb. His sleep was fractured by unpleasant dreams that had him tossing and turning as though in an attempt to escape them. He dreamed of red eyes, Pettigrew's blistering face, and Severus, growing fainter and fainter as he retreated, saying, "You'll be better off without me." Harry awoke with a gasp, shaking and sweating, clutching his pillow like he used to do, when it was the closest he'd ever get to having someone's arms around him. But then Severus was there, his warm presence melding into the space like a well-fitted glove, laying a careful hand on Harry's back and stroking tentatively when Harry didn't pull away. "Please don't go," Harry whispered. Severus brushed Harry's hair away from his forehead. "I won't." Harry turned over onto his back to meet the man's eyes. "No, I mean, even if you think I'm angry, even if I am angry, I don't want anyone." Harry took a deep breath and grabbed Severus' hand. I don't want anyone else but you. Harry squeezed Severus' hand more tightly, enough that he was surely causing him pain. But the man just squeezed back, then dislodged his fingers so he could reach out with both arms to pull Harry closer, to hold him, clutching him like he couldn't help it, like he couldn't stay away even if he thought it might be easier to pull back before Harry pushed him away. It only made Harry want to cling tighter. Chapter 48. Worth Missing. Chapter text. The only word that could sufficiently describe the atmosphere at breakfast the next morning was awkward. Severus had a new edition of one of his weekly potions journals laid out on the table next to his plate, but minutes had passed since he'd last turned a page. He wasn't eating either, and his tea had long since stopped steaming. It might have helped if Severus had said something, because he obviously had something on his mind. Likely something related to the conversation they'd had the previous night, as evidenced by the man's eyes frequently darting towards Harry before glancing back at the journal, like he'd just noticed it was there. Harry tried not to let it affect his appetite, since he'd just discovered the joy of spreading butter and jam on his toast, and he wanted to enjoy it in peace. He made short work of his first slice, then reached for the blackcurrant jam to try on his second one. Unfortunately, his elbow jabbed into his half-full glass of pumpkin juice in the process and knocked it clean off the table. Harry's brain seemed to short out at the sound of breaking glass, and he didn't know where he was. He just knew it was bad. He'd done something bad. He's going to kill me. Vernon will be mad. Warm hands gripping Harry's shoulders dragged him back to reality, and he stared wide-eyed into Severus' face, inches away from his own. Deep breath, Severus said in a slow, deliberate tone of voice. Harry dragged in some air once, twice, 3 times, still feeling like he wasn't getting quite enough oxygen. Good. A little slower this time, Severus said, just as steadily. Harry did as he was told, and gradually his breaths grew deep and regular, and his chest stopped feeling like it was being crushed beneath a Vernon-sized shoe. Severus was still holding onto Harry's shoulders, so Harry opted to stare at his arms because he wasn't sure he wanted to see the expression on the man's face. What is wrong with me? It's been ages since. Why do I keep thinking I'm still there? It's stupid, Harry said under his breath. What is? Severus asked. He released Harry's shoulders and dragged his chair closer. Harry sighed irritably. You know what? The only stupid thing I have witnessed in the past 5 minutes is a blatantly unfounded theory in my potions periodical. Harry's lips twitched against his will, because wasn't that such a Severus thing to say? He took a long breath, the fullness of it loosening his chest a little more. I panicked over a broken glass. How is that not stupid? You reacted in response to repeated experiences that taught you to fear the outcome of breaking a glass, Severus said, sounding annoyingly reasonable. Harry jerked his head up. How do you know that anyway? He snapped. I never said anything happened. Severus tilted his head. Would you like to tell me what happened? Harry opened his mouth to say no, but something gave him pause. What was the real reason he didn't want to tell? Because he used to get in trouble for telling. He was trying not to react to old things that didn't happen anymore, so perhaps telling tales, as Petunia used to call them, would be a start. Harry swallowed against the rising lump in his throat. I used to break things a lot when I was little because they'd make me carry things to the table that were heavy. He inhaled sharply, tapping his heel against the leg of his chair. Sometimes Petunia would just yell at me or slap me, but it wasn't. Harry bunched his fists. It wasn't as bad as when my magic would repair the broken things. Then they'd get scared, and Vernon would. Harry's voice faded to a whisper, then failed him completely. Shouts, curses, pain, locks clicking, dark cupboards, and he never could figure out how to make it stop. It's not fair. Harry wasn't sure how he ended up on his feet, but his chair had toppled over behind him when he shoved it back to stand, his eyes welling with angry tears. Severus was still sitting right where he was, his eyes not leaving Harry. I could fix the stupid broken glass, but I couldn't make them stop hurting me. Harry pressed his lips together, squeezing his eyes shut to stop the tears from leaking out. He let Severus pull him close and wrap his arms around him, but he didn't hug back, his anger rendering him stiff and unyielding in the embrace. He was so angry. Angry that he'd lived with people who'd hurt him for things he couldn't control, and angry that his own magic couldn't stop them. He was angry that Severus hadn't been there to stop them. Severus should have been there. But instead, he ran to Voldemort to tell him about a damned prophecy, and then he pretended Harry didn't exist until he was forced to take him in. He hadn't even wanted to take him, but he did anyway, and apparently started loving him somewhere along the way. Funny how that love couldn't fix what happened before. You have every right to be angry, Severus said over Harry's head, his chest rumbling against Harry's forehead with the words. Had Harry spoken some of his thoughts out loud, or was Severus just using that uncanny ability he had to read Harry's thoughts without legilimency? It is unfair, it is infuriating, and many individuals who should have known better played a part in your suffering. Severus pushed Harry back a little to meet his eyes, his thumb catching a stray tear that had dripped to Harry's chin. You are allowed to be angry with me. Harry just blinked at him, his vision still blurry with tears. Or was that because he wasn't wearing his glasses? Severus must have removed them at some point. You are allowed to be angry. You are allowed to rage at me for what I have done and have not done, and I will have no counter. Harry dropped his eyes. No matter what you say to me, Harry, I will not leave you alone. Severus lifted Harry's chin with 2 fingers. Do you understand me? Harry just shrugged, feeling too drained to formulate a response. You are safe with me, and I will not leave. Harry's eyes started watering again, and he tried to breathe slowly in the hope that he wouldn't cry for real. He didn't need Severus to tell Harry he was safe. Harry knew that. He'd known that for a long time. I know, Harry whispered, because he probably should. Sometimes Severus needed to hear things out loud too, just like Harry did. Good. Severus brushed Harry's hair out of his eyes and pushed his glasses onto his face. Now you haven't eaten nearly enough, so... You haven't eaten anything, Harry shot back, his voice emerging a little thickly. Severus narrowed his eyes, then glanced over at his untouched plate. Perhaps we can both make another attempt at breakfast, he conceded. He waved his wand to clear away the mess of broken glass and pumpkin juice and returned to his seat. After Harry finished his second piece of toast and was mindlessly stirring sugar into a cup of tea he probably wouldn't drink, Severus cleared his throat, reaching into his robes to pull out a folded piece of parchment. This was addressed to you, he said in a strange tone of voice, thrusting it towards Harry. From Sirius Black. Harry stiffened in surprise, reflexively taking hold of the parchment. After a moment's hesitation, he unfolded it to find a shaky, ink-spotted scrawl that took a bit of squinting to read. Dear Harry, you wouldn't remember meeting me, but I'll never forget when I met you. When your parents were at the hospital for your birth, I got it in my head to have a home-cooked meal ready for them when they got back. Nearly set their kitchen on fire, and had to call Remus and Peter to help me clean up the mess. Good thing your parents were so enamored with you that they didn't notice the scorch marks when they came home to a hot meal that was mostly Remus doing. You were barely a day old and had a head full of hair just like your dad's. And I swear to Merlin you smiled at me, even though Lily scoffed at that and said you were too young to smile and that it was just a reflex. I was so proud when they asked me to be your godfather, but I was also terrified that I'd mess it up. And I did mess it up, because I wasn't there for you when you needed me. I wanted to take you from the first, but I let myself get distracted by that bass Peter, and the next thing I knew, I was locked in Azkaban for life. Your parents would be ashamed of me. I want to do better now, if you'll let me. There's no one in this world who can tell you more about your dad than I can. I'm sure you heard plenty about your mum from your aunt, but she never knew James very well. No one can replace your parents, but your family to me. You're one of the only good memories I have left that the Dementors couldn't take away from me, and sometimes I wish Remus tells me you've been living with Severus Snape for a while. I can't wrap my head around how that happened, but I hope he's treating you well. I'd like to see for myself that you're okay. That's not the only reason I want to see you, of course. I've been wanting to see you for 10 years. I wanted to see you the moment I got out of prison, but they stuck me in St. Mungo's at first, and well, I was a right mess and didn't want to scare you. I'm staying with Remus for the time being, though I'm not quite sure what I'll be doing around here when Remus gets back to teaching. It's better than hiding away at my hellscape of a sorry excuse for a childhood home, at any rate. Either way, I'll be here waiting for you whenever you're ready to come. Love, Sirius. Harry read through the letter twice, because the first time he did felt more like he was reading a story about someone else's life, someone who had nothing to do with him. The parents in the story couldn't really be his, the baby couldn't really be him. But it was. It was just so strange to think about, that a living connection to his family remained, that a person who'd known him as a baby was speaking to him through this letter. Harry carefully folded the parchment and set it next to his plate, then raised his eyes. He furrowed his brow at Severus' tense stance. The man was clutching the edges of the table so tightly his knuckles were white, and he had that look on his face that Harry had long since learned meant he was anxious. "What?" Harry finally asked. "I beg your pardon," Harry huffed. "You're all." He waved his hand, unable to find the right words. Severus raised an eyebrow, then extracted his hands from the edge of the table. "What did your godfather have to say?" Harry eyed the letter. "He wants to meet me." Snape sucked in a shallow breath. "I expected as much." He took another longer, deeper breath. "The only factor of importance is whether you would like to meet him." Harry opened his mouth, but something in Severus' face gave him pause. He seemed to be braced for something, as though Harry's answer might hurt him. "Why, I think I do. Want to meet him," Harry said, his gaze direct. Severus' face didn't change. "But I don't want to go alone." He lowered his eyes, because it was a bit mad, wasn't it, that he was afraid to go alone, to meet the man who Harry's parents had entrusted with the role of godfather. "I don't even know him. He doesn't know me either. Maybe he liked me as a baby, but that doesn't mean he'll like me now. I will, of course, accompany you to your visit, if that is what you wish." Harry bit his lip. "You don't have to if you don't." "Harry," Severus cut him off. "The only reason I would not wish to accompany you is if you expressly preferred I did not." "Oh." Harry stared at the table for a moment, swinging his legs. "Why don't you like them?" he suddenly asked. Severus didn't pretend to misunderstand. He let out a tired sigh, rubbing at his forehead with the heel of his hand. "Your father and I, as well as Black, Lupin, and Pettigrew, did not get along well at school." Harry raised a skeptical eyebrow. "That's all, then." "You just didn't get along, and that's why," Severus' jaw tightened. "You do not need to know the grisly details of my interactions with them. They concern your father and godfather, and my feelings about them are irrelevant. It is yours that matter." "You don't want me to meet him?" Severus narrowed his eyes to slits. "Did I not just tell you that my feelings are irrelevant?" Harry shrugged. "That doesn't change the fact that you don't want me to meet him." Severus stared at Harry for a moment before shaking his head exasperatedly. "You're impossible." Harry held his hands out, palms up, as if to concede the point. Severus blew out a breath. "All right, then. If you're so insistent, yes, I admit, a part of me does not want you to meet him. Rather, I do not want to afford him the privilege of meeting you. Yet, as your parent, I believe it to be imperative that you meet him." "Why?" asked Harry. Severus met Harry's gaze. "It is of vital importance that you form trusted relationships with adults beyond myself, should there ever come a time when I am unable to look after you." The room felt as though it had just dropped several degrees, and Harry's terror at the thought of Severus, words becoming reality, must have been showing quite clearly on his face, because Severus reached across the table and covered Harry's slackened hand with his own. "I do not say that to frighten you, Harry," Severus said quietly. "I have every intention of seeing you through to adulthood and well beyond." "But you think you might not," Harry said in a small voice, staring at his plate. He twitched his fingers beneath Severus' hand. "Harry, look at me, please." Harry didn't want to, but the way Severus had phrased the question made it hard to ignore. The man hadn't been ordering Harry, he'd been requesting, perhaps even pleading. He lifted his head. "I believe that I will," Severus began. "I cannot comprehend the idea of another individual raising you in my stead, and there are no lengths to which I will not go to ensure that you remain in my care and have a safe, stable home." He stopped to heave a breath. But any parent worthy of the title would have contingency plans in place should the worst-case scenario come to pass. Harry bit down on the inside of his lip hard enough to taste blood. "Sirius Black is your contingency plan?" he asked. Severus closed his eyes. "I have not yet determined if he can be trusted with that task, but even if he is incapable, it is still important for you to form connections with people whom you can call family." Severus opened his eyes, pulling his hand back to cross his arms over his chest. "Even if that never becomes necessary, you should still have other people in your life." Harry mulled that over, then finally nodded. "When should I go see him?" "If you'd like to meet him before the end of the holiday, you've only got today and tomorrow before we return to school." "Tomorrow, then." Severus gave a short nod. "I will owl Lupin to inform him." The next morning found Harry hurrying to keep up with Severus' rapid stride as he led the way down the path to the edge of the property. "Where does Lupin live?" Harry asked as the man waved his wand to let them pass through. "Yorkshire," he said shortly, taking Harry's hand. "Brace yourself." Harry squeezed his eyes shut, preparing for the unsettling sensation. When he opened his eyes, gasping hard, his shoulders caught in Severus' grip. They were standing just outside a small, run-down cottage half concealed by shrubbery that looked like it had been built 100 years ago. He'd never seen any houses like that in Surrey or London. The area Jade had lived in had lots of old, terraced houses, but not as old as this. Though overgrown, the shrubbery gave the cottage a lived-in, warm sort of appearance. He glanced up at Severus. "Is this it?" Severus nodded, then took Harry's arm and led him to the door. He rapped his knuckles against it, the motion tense and impatient, and the door almost immediately opened. "Severus, Harry, welcome," Lupin said genially, stepping back to allow them to pass. Severus jerked his head irritably and pushed Harry through the door ahead of him. Harry hesitantly returned Lupin's smile, then glanced around what appeared to be the sitting room. It was quite small, much smaller than Severus' house, the single sofa worn and sagging and the wooden floors faded. It was pleasantly warm, though, a hearty fire burning in the fireplace, and the scent of something freshly baked was wafting from another room. "I'll fetch Sirius. He's in his bedroom," said Lupin. "He's been finding it hard to keep track of time after spending so long in prison." A grim expression crossed his face, and he turned to walk down the hallway. Harry glanced at Severus out of the corner of his eye. The man was standing stiffly with his arms crossed over his chest, studying the room as though looking for death traps or escape routes. Harry opened his mouth to comment on that, but he snapped it shut when Lupin re-emerged, accompanied by a dark-haired man who was staring at Harry like he'd never seen a human before. He was tall, taller than Severus, and very thin, his skin unnaturally pale, which Harry assumed was a result of his time in prison. He was clean-shaven, which only emphasized the gauntness of his face, in which his grey eyes seemed too large. There was something vaguely familiar about him. "Harry," Sirius said hoarsely, stepping forward with his arms outstretched. Harry couldn't stop himself from taking a jerky step backwards, nearly tripping over Severus' foot. His guardian caught him by the upper arms and kept his hands there, squeezing a little. Sirius pulled back, grimacing. "Right. Remus said you were a bit jumpy. I should. He took a careful step closer, then held out a hand for Harry to shake. Harry took it, dislodging himself from Severus' grip in the process, his face burning. Had Lupin really warned Sirius about Harry's tendency to jump out of his skin at unexpected contact? That was kind of embarrassing. He refrained from glancing at Lupin and looked up at Sirius, who had a tremulous smile on his face. "You look just like him," Sirius breathed, still holding Harry's hand. "Merlin, it's like looking at a first-year James all over again. But with Lily's eyes," he trailed off, still staring. "Perhaps you'd like to release the boy's hand and offer him a seat," Snape's caustic voice cut into the tense silence. Sirius dropped Harry's hand as though burned, and Lupin cleared his throat. "Ah, yes, how rude of me. Why don't we sit down for tea in the kitchen?" Severus let out an unrestrained snort, but he made no objections when Lupin led them into the small, warm kitchen that had fresh scones cooling on the counter. He did, however, insist on standing by the doorway rather than sitting at the table, hovering like some sort of dour member of the Queen's Guard. Sirius didn't take his eyes off Harry for a moment, still staring as they sat across one another at the table while Lupin poured tea. He started. Sirius heaved a shallow breath, holding his hands over the steam of his tea as though warming them. "I can't tell you how good it is to finally see you." Harry forced a half-smile, at an utter loss of what to say. Blimey, it's a lot easier to talk in a letter than it is in person," said Sirius, rubbing his forehead. Harry smiled, for real this time. I know what you mean," he said in a tentative voice. "Talking is hard." Sirius let out a short laugh. "That's one thing I never heard your dad say." Harry shrugged. "Never met him." Sirius' smile faded. "I wish to Merlin that wasn't the case," he said quietly. "And losing your relatives on top of everything, I'm so sorry." "I'm not," Harry cut in, his voice emerging more sharply than he intended. Sirius snapped his mouth shut, looking a bit stunned, and Harry folded his arms across his chest, staring at his still steaming tea. This was it then. Sirius was going to realize that Harry wasn't really worth missing for 10 years in prison. It didn't matter. He had Severus, who'd done worse things than not be sorry his relatives died, but it was still Harry's head shot up when Sirius let out a loud bark of laughter. Can't say I shed a tear when my dear old mum kicked it. It was Harry's turn to stare. Sirius was still chuckling, one hand pressed against his thin chest like it hurt him to laugh. So Snape took you in when they passed? Sirius asked when he finally stopped laughing, his eyes darting up towards Severus, who was still standing by the doorway. Why's that? Dumbledore himself should have done it, rather than that git. I highly suggest you stop talking, Severus cut in silkily, lest I put my authority as Harry's guardian to good use and bar you from speaking with him again. Harry bit his lip. It was unlikely that Severus would actually do that, what with the way he'd gone on about how bloody imperative it was for Harry to get to know Sirius. But still, the tension between the two men was palpable, and Lupin hovering between them against the counter was only adding to it. You know what? Sirius snapped, slapping his hands down on the table and rattling his teacup. I'd like to talk to Harry alone, make sure he's really okay, and not just making a show of it for your benefit. Are the words legal guardian somehow foreign to you? Listen, you, Sirius, Lupin cut in, stepping forward smoothly to rest a hand on Sirius' shoulder, who relaxed minutely at the contact. This isn't helpful. He then looked at Severus. Would you be amenable to giving Harry and Sirius a few minutes alone to talk? There was a long, fraught pause, and Harry's eyes darted back and forth, unable to decide which person to settle on. Finally, Severus broke off his icy gaze towards Sirius and met Harry's eyes, furrowing his brow in question. Harry gave a very slight nod. Very well, Severus said, brushing invisible dust off his sleeve. 10 minutes. He turned on his heel and stalked out the door, Lupin hurrying out behind him. Ha, said Sirius, leaning back. I was expecting more of a fight. Harry frowned, his shoulders hunching. He'd have preferred there not to be any fight, but no one was asking him, were they? What did they do to you? Harry's head jerked upward. What? Your relatives? Sirius grimaced. They had to have been bad for you to prefer Snape. Harry directed a glare at Sirius. That's not true. They weren't so bad. No, that Severus is the lesser of two evils. A thoughtful look crossed Sirius' face. You're clever, I can tell. Your dad was too, but you remind me of Lily the way you cut to the heart of the matter. His eyes grew distant to the degree that he looked as though he'd left his body somehow, his consciousness far away, in a different place and a different time. Harry raised his eyebrows, a bit thrown, and waited for Sirius to speak again. So they were bad then, your relatives, Sirius stated, his gaze sharpening. They were, Harry said quietly. Sirius closed his eyes, and when he opened them they looked haunted, the opposite of distant, really, tethered to the earth despite his desire to be anywhere else. And Snape is taking care of you. You have everything you need. Harry nodded. They hit you. Harry flinched at the question, feeling unaccountably angry. Did your mother hit you? He bit out. Let Sirius feel what it was like to get that kind of question thrown at him. Sirius smiled mirthlessly, only when she didn't have her wand on hand. His smile abruptly faded, his mouth contorting into a pained rictus. He pressed a hand against his forehead. I shouldn't have. I'm making a mess of this. He muttered something else under his breath that Harry couldn't hear. Remus was probably right that it was too soon to see you, but you were my responsibility. Sirius stood so abruptly that Harry jolted back wildly and tumbled off his chair to the floor. He stared up at Sirius, his heart pounding, to see the man looking stricken. Merlin, I'm sorry, he said, a shaky undertone in his voice. He was scratching rapidly at a spot on the inside of his wrist, a repeated motion that seemed unintentional. Didn't mean to scare you. Harry exhaled slowly. It's okay. Lupin did tell you I was twitchy, he said in a tone of forced casualness. Sirius studied him for a moment, blinking rapidly, then approached slowly, leaning down to offer Harry a hand. After a pause, Harry took it, allowing the man to pull him to his feet. They both took their seats once more and sat in silence for several long minutes. Who am I kidding? Sirius mumbled, covering his face with one hand. Harry furrowed his brow. What? I'm in no state to dress myself properly half the time, let alone even think of fighting for guardianship over you, as if I ever had a chance in the first place. Harry tensed. I am happy where I am, I don't need, but I should have been. Serious. Voice emerged as a rasping sort of sob, though his face was dry when he lowered his hand. I should have been there for you, and instead I left you alone to be raised by monsters. And having been raised by some of those myself, I should have done everything I could to protect you from that." Harry's throat tightened, and he bit his lip hard, the slight pain of it steadying him enough to meet Sirius' eyes. He wasn't quite sure what to say. It's so bloody hard to imagine that you're any better off with him. "Severus is a good guardian," Harry said defensively. "I believe you," Sirius said after a pause. "If you say you're happy, then you're happy." He let out a choked breath. I just wish it could have been me instead." "We can still, be friends," Harry offered, "if Snape'll let that happen. He said he wants me to have other people around in case he dies." Harry wasn't going to say that out loud. "He'll let it happen." Sirius smiled, and it made him look remarkably different. Suddenly, Harry realized why he'd seemed familiar. "Were you my dad's best man at his wedding?" Harry asked. Sirius' grin widened. "I was. How do you know?" "I saw you in a picture." A longing look crossed Sirius' face, and Harry added, "I can show you sometime." Sirius drew a shaky breath. That would be great," he said, his smile looking shaky. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, as though steadying himself, and when he opened them, he'd lost that longing look. "So, Ravenclaw, eh?" he asked with a wink. "Now, let me tell you, everyone thinks the Ravenclaws are the goody-two-shoes of the school, but from what I've seen, they just like to make us think that." Harry let out a short laugh. "We're just quieter about the rules we break. We Gryffindors just like the drama of it all." He leaned forward. "So, tell me before Snape comes stalking back in here, what kind of trouble have you managed to get yourself into?" "Well, I have my dad's invisibility cloak." The grin on Sirius' face looked positively gleeful. "So I've sneaked into the restricted section." "And of course you did," Sirius interrupted, rolling his eyes dramatically. "You really are a Ravenclaw." Harry snorted. "Guess so." Sirius leaned forward then, to regale Harry with tales of his Hogwarts days in the company of a wolf, a stag and rat, and a girl with red hair and as big a heart as anyone he'd ever known. And Harry found himself leaning in closer, eager to hear more. Chapter 49. A Shared Affliction. Chapter text: Sirius Black has been exonerated, did you hear? He was framed, apparently. Well, I heard. Those were just a few of the snippets of conversation Harry overheard as he picked at his breakfast on his first day back at Hogwarts after Christmas. He hadn't realized how notorious Sirius' case was, but it seemed that his imprisonment was common knowledge in the wizarding world. Harry could only be grateful that most people only knew about the alleged murder of 13 people and not about how his family had been involved. "It's mad, isn't it?" Stephen was saying from several seats away. "Everyone always talked about him like he was the most dangerous supporter of you-know-who, and now they're saying he was framed all along." Harry slid out of his seat, as inconspicuously as he could, and grabbed his bag from underneath it. He wasn't sure why he was finding the topic so uncomfortable to listen to, but he knew he needed to get away. Maybe it's because they're all talking about it, like it's just a story, Harry thought as he walked towards the Charms classroom. Like it's about characters in a book, and not real people. Harry didn't want to even try imagining what it would have been like to be imprisoned with Dementors for a decade, forced to relive his worst memories over and over again. Harry hadn't noticed it when he'd first met Sirius, as overwhelming as it had been, but looking back, there had been a flatness behind Sirius' grin, a deadness behind his eyes, a pain so deep and impenetrable that succumbing to numbness might very well be the only way to face getting up in the morning. Harry nearly stumbled over the slight incline at the entrance to the Charms classroom, but he caught himself at the last moment and settled in a seat near the back. He opened his textbook at random, leaning in to read the chapter on the severing charm. Even though he'd learned the spell ages ago, it was better than thinking. "Hey, Harry," said Sue, dropping into the seat beside him. Harry glanced up with a grin, as glad for the distraction as he was to see her. "How was Christmas?" "Nice, actually," she said, fishing through her bag. "Thanks for the book. Had to pry it from my brother's cold, dead hands." She smiled mischievously. He wouldn't stop talking about how wonderful it must be to be friends with the Harry Potter. Harry flushed, shoving her shoulder. "Shut up." Sue laughed and shoved him back. "Does that mean you won't give me an autograph for him? You'd have to pry it from my cold, dead hands." Flitwick chose that moment to enter the classroom, so they both did their best to muffle their laughter as the professor began taking roll. Boot, Brocklehurst, Corner, Cornfoot, Goldstein, yes. Yes, I'm very glad to see you back. But perhaps you should refrain from performing the shrinking charm before I've discussed the risks of miscasting. Thankfully, there were no major mishaps with the spell, likely a result of Flitwick drilling into their heads the incident that had occurred in a Gryffindor class several years ago, when a student had accidentally shrunk his head, very nearly causing himself a brain injury, and had to spend several days recovering in the hospital wing. Later, during herbology, Harry eyed Zabini nervously out of the corner of his eye as he trimmed his wormhood sprig. He had yet to thank the boy for his gift, the newly developed spell, and considering that Harry hadn't thought to give him anything, it was pretty embarrassing. Harry cautiously sidled closer to Zabini, who was unfortunately situated next to Malfoy. True, the Prat hadn't started anything with Harry in ages, but Harry did take care to avoid him. "Potter," Zabini greeted when Harry approached. Harry could feel Malfoy's gaze pressing into the side of his face, and he studiously ignored it. I haven't had a chance to thank you," Harry said awkwardly. "For the thing you sent me. I didn't expect," Zabini waved a hand. "No worries, I knew you wouldn't expect it." Harry chewed the inside of his lip for a moment, then nodded. "Well, thanks," he said. "I've never really." Harry cut himself off before he finished his sentence with "got gifts before," because that just sounded pathetic. "So you're friends with Ravenclaws now, are you?" Malfoy finally said, clearly having held his tongue for long enough. "Why, yes, Draco," Zabini drawled. "There are many benefits to expanding one's social horizons. Perhaps you should try it." Malfoy huffed and pointedly turned his back on Zabini, flicking his wand too sharply at his plant and severing it in half. He cursed under his breath. "Was it something I said?" Zabini asked, holding out his hands in an exaggerated motion. Harry bit back a snort. "I'm a benefit to you, am I?" he asked. "Expanding your social horizons and all." Zabini half smiled. "You're interesting." Harry sliced off a dead leaf with his wand. "Not trying to be. Even better." When herbology was over, Harry made his way to Severus' office, and he only had to fight off a faint voice in the back of his head that told him he shouldn't, that Severus wouldn't want him there. He knew better. Also knew that he just wanted the man's company right now, just to sit quietly in his presence, and assure himself that the bleakness he'd seen in Severus' eyes over Christmas, as he told Harry of his worst misdeeds, wasn't drowning him completely. "Harry," Severus greeted as Harry walked in. The man appeared to be positively inundated with paperwork, but he shifted some of the parchment so Harry could set down homework on the other side of the desk. "How has your first day back been treating you?" Severus asked, not pausing in his scribbling. "All right." Harry dumped his charms textbook on the desk to begin the essay Flitwick had assigned. "Everyone keeps talking about Sirius being released, and it's just strange, I guess." Severus glanced up at that. "His imprisonment was widely reported at the time," he said, "in part a result of the Ministry's attempt to placate the public." "Why would that placate people?" Harry asked, frowning. Severus blew out a quick breath, setting down his quill. At the time of the Dark Lord's defeat and Black's arrest, the British wizarding community had been at war for over a decade, and the government had been quite ineffective on that front. When the Dark Lord fell, there was much celebration, but when the dust settled, people grew frustrated, angry that they had lost so many years. So many people, to this war that the Ministry did not prevent. That it took you, a baby, to end the war rather than the elected officials in whom they'd placed their trust. Harry bit his lip, glancing down uncomfortably. "So they wanted a scapegoat?" he asked. "Someone to blame?" "It seemed as much," said Severus. "Black's conviction made the public feel as though justice was being served, and for some it was enough." "That's horrible," Harry said in a quiet voice. "Yes," Severus said simply, "but unsurprising." They both returned to their work in a somber silence, only broken by the scratching of quills. After some time, Harry heard Severus inhale in the way he did when he was about to speak, and he glanced up. "Albus has conveyed to me that he may be able to offer an explanation for some of the events that occurred on Christmas," he said, his jaw tightening minutely. "I had intended to meet with him this evening, so if you'd like to join me." Harry nodded rapidly, agreeing before Severus could finish his sentence. The man let out a dry chuckle. When Harry finished his S and Severus completed his, whatever he was doing, they made their way to the headmaster's office, and Harry had to resist the childish urge to hide behind Severus as they entered. He had been there alone before, but it was the subject matter that was making him feel rather unsettled, not the location. Dumbledore smiled placidly as they entered the room and gestured towards two squashy armchairs for them to sit on. "Hope the two of you had a very Merry Christmas together," he said, clasping his hands together as they sat. "I myself had a splendid time learning the perfect knitting patterns for next year's Christmas socks." Severus just jerked his head irritably, and Dumbledore chuckled as though he had made some sort of hilarious joke. "Let us focus upon the matter at hand, shall we?" Severus said tersely. "Harry has dinner to attend, and I have potions to tend to." "Of course you do," Dumbledore murmured. He smoothed his hand over a small, mangled-looking black book. He cleared his throat. "Yes, you'll be wanting the information I have procured to explain Harry's unusual experience on Christmas Day." He caught Harry's eye, who categorically refused to look away. "I do hope you haven't found yourself unduly haunted by those upsetting events, Harry." Harry shrugged, giving in to the urge to drop his eyes. "I'm fine." Dumbledore sighed, the sound so heavy that Harry looked up again. "Are so very resilient," Dumbledore said, his eyes dimming the slightest bit. "That he is," Severus positively growled. "Now may we press on, lest Harry's resilience is tested further." Dumbledore's eyes snapped back into focus. "I have told you before, Harry, that I placed you with your late relatives due to the protection that resided in your mother's blood, which built what one might refer to as a magical barrier within the very walls of the home that prevented the entry of anyone who wished you harm." "Yes, you told me that," Harry said flatly. "I had not realized, until I was informed of your altercation with Voldemort, that your mother's protection extended quite so far." Harry furrowed his brow. "You mean that thing that happened when I touched Pettigrew's face was because of my mother?" Dumbledore inclined his head. "The love your mother demonstrated on the night of her death, the love mired in sacrifice, is a magic of its own kind, a magic that a being like Voldemort cannot understand nor tolerate. He could not pass the walls of your relatives' home, and it seems that he cannot touch you at all, not without experiencing unbearable pain, which is why he fled the body of Peter Pettigrew so quickly." Harry stared for a moment. His mother's love for him had given him this power. This power that only worked against Voldemort. How did that even make sense? Did she do something? Harry asked. I mean, did she do some sort of magic before she died to make this happen? "That I cannot say," said Dumbledore contemplatively. "Your mother was a formidable witch, that's for certain." Harry glanced at Severus, and by the look on his face, he didn't seem to know anything more. "Is there anything else that requires clarification?" Dumbledore asked. Harry shook his head, but Severus let out a weird sort of scoff. "You best be off to dinner, Harry," said Severus in a too neutral tone. Harry narrowed his eyes, understanding all too well that he was being dismissed so that Severus and Dumbledore could talk about something without him there. But frankly, he didn't really care at the moment. Plus, he was hungry. "Tell me you have made some progress, Albus," Severus demanded as soon as the door closed behind Harry. "Even the slightest inkling as to how we may remove the blasted thing from Harry's soul would be a boon. I have destroyed another Horcrux." Albus set his hand down upon the small, leather-bound book, with a jagged hole cutting through the middle that had been on his desk in plain sight all this time. Severus had to physically refrain from leaning away. "How did you obtain it?" he asked, oddly unable to look away from the object now that he knew what it was. Not unlike the sight of a deadly accident, or the mangled bodies he'd once seen strewn across the ground, Albus' eyes crinkled. "It required the freeing of a certain very unusual house elf. Upon receiving clothes, the poor elf was more than happy to confirm my suspicions and retrieve it for me. The elf's former owner possessed it." "He did." Malfoy. The answer was so obvious that Severus was kicking himself for not immediately realizing it when Albus had mentioned the elf. Rather negligent on the Dark Lord's part to entrust an item of such value to the likes of Malfoy. Negligent of him, yes, but fortunate for everyone else. "You utilized the same method of destruction as you did the other." "I did." Severus heaved a breath, dragging in air for what felt like the first time in far too long. "Has this brought you any closer to finding a solution for Harry?" Albus ran his thumb across the edge of the ruined book. "I wish I had a concrete answer with which to provide you." "I'm not asking for a concrete answer," Severus said through gritted teeth. I'm asking for something, for any indication that you've made even the slightest bit of progress. I am in the process of devising a spell of my own making, said Albus, as casually as though he were discussing the recent snowfall. Severus straightened. You believe there may be a spell that could extract the Horcrux in some way? He asked, his voice very nearly trembling. How could that be possible, particularly in light of the fact that Harry's case has never before been seen? Albus steepled his hands. As I said, I have no concrete solutions, and by all means my plan should be impossible if not for this. He placed his wand carefully on the desk and rolled it closer to Severus, who stared at it, perplexed. He had never any given thought to Albus' wand, had never given it more than a passing glance, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was quite long, roughly 15 inches, and of a relatively pale wood, elder perhaps. It seemed weathered, too, even accounting for Albus' age. Severus glanced away from the wand, towards Albus, whose eyes flitted away for the briefest moment before meeting Severus' gaze. This wand, he said, was not purchased from a wand-maker, present nor past. He paused, his eyes following the length of the wand. It was mastered, conquered, if you will, some years ago, and has what one may describe as unique properties, which I believe may be of help to us in saving Harry. I have never heard of such an object, Severus said shortly. To my knowledge, it is not the wand but the wielder that provides its power. Albus inclined his head. That is true for this wand as well. Were you to cast a spell with my wand at this moment, you would detect no difference in the power of your casting. Yet, for the master of this wand, certain feats believed to be impossible may be so no longer. His face sagged slightly. With that potential comes a great burden, one which I have spent many years contemplating the meaning of, and whether it is worth it. Clearly, you wish to remain cryptic, Severus said sharply, and I have not the wherewithal to rail against that tendency in you. But if this wand of yours can bring us closer to a solution, it will bloody well be worth it. Severus wasn't sure when he'd risen to his feet, but he was standing ramrod straight, his fists clenched so tightly the muscles in his forearms ached. So it will, Albus said quietly. So it will. Ron slid into the seat next to Harry in the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom the following day and shot him a grin. Ron, Harry nodded to him. How was Christmas? You're all right after. Ron nodded, grimacing. It's mad, isn't it, that Scabbers was a person all this time? What happened after you woke up? Asked Harry. I know Severus Snape brought you back to the castle, and your brothers came for you. Ron gave a half-smile. My parents came back from Romania as soon as they found out, and we went home for the rest of the holiday. His smile turned wry. Mum wouldn't stop fussing, and my dad was so upset that he hadn't realized about Scabbers. Kept going on about how his family had been in danger. That's nice of them, Harry said. What is? That they cut the trip short. Ron gave Harry an odd look. Well, of course they did. Wouldn't Snape do the same for you? The way he is about you, he'd probably rush back from a vacation on another planet if he heard you got a paper cut. Harry blinked a few times, but his contemplation was interrupted by Lupin walking into the room. The professor didn't waste any time in introducing them to the wind barrier spell, which produced a powerful force, not unlike a gust of wind, that would push against an attacker and prevent them from approaching. What's notable about the wind barrier spell is its relative unpredictability. A perfect result may appear noticeably different from another, equally perfect result, which presents a challenge in both mastering and defending against it. He paused to draw his wand and raised it high over his head, bringing it down in a long, smooth stroke towards his desk. Producendum arbis. The desk was shoved backwards several feet by an invisible force. As you will see, no two casts are quite alike. Lupin proved his point by casting the spell again, which shoved the desk further, though this time to the left. It's not a matter of aim, he explained. The spell draws from the smallest breezes within the vicinity and takes its direction from there. They were then instructed to pair up for practice, and every so often, Lupin would tell them to switch partners so they could practice defending against different styles of casting. Thanks so much for the book, Harry, Hermione exclaimed when they paired up. It was so fascinating to read about ancient wizarding history, particularly the chapter that discussed wizarding society during the Celtic era. Learning about goblin wars in Bin's class was interesting at first, but that's all he ever teaches. Harry smiled wryly. You can admit it's boring, I won't tell anyone. Hermione bit back a snort. Everyone was sufficiently out of breath by the time Lupin dismissed them. Before Harry could leave, however, Lupin called after him. "Harry, stay behind for a moment, would you?" Harry hung back as the classroom cleared and approached Lupin's desk. The man fumbled through the pocket of his robes and pulled out a scroll of parchment. "From Sirius. I'm certain he'll be owling you as well, but he just couldn't wait." Lupin handed over the scroll, smiling, and Harry smiled back and pocketed it. Something was holding him back from leaving, though. Can I ask a question?" Harry asked, forcing out the words against his hesitance. "Certainly," said Lupin, summoning a chair closer to his desk for Harry to sit on. Harry cleared his throat, sitting on the edge of the chair. "If you were such good friends with my father and knew me as a baby, why didn't I meet you when I was younger?" Lupin let out a long sigh, slumping over a little in his seat. "You have every right to an answer," he said. "Merlin knows how much I regret that." Harry straightened his shoulders, waiting. "The answer is complicated, though by no means an excuse for my absence," Lupin said. "It's best I start with the most straightforward explanation." He paused. "I'm sure you've noticed my frequent sick leaves during my brief tenure as a professor." Harry nodded. "I do have a chronic affliction," he said, "though it is not an ordinary illness." "What is it?" Harry asked, puzzled. I am a werewolf." Harry's eyes went wide. Really, Lupin was watching Harry with a cautious expression on his face, as though he was half expecting Harry to explode or something. "I was bitten when I was very young," Lupin continued. "And by Albus, Goodwill I was able to attend Hogwarts, where I met your father, Sirius, and Peter." "Did they know?" Harry asked. "Not at first," Lupin said. I had been trained from a young age to never disclose my condition, so I did not tell them." "Why were you trained to do that?" "I suppose it stands to reason that you wouldn't know, having been raised in the Muggle world, but werewolves are not looked upon well by magical society," he said. "Primarily due to fear, which, of course, is not unfounded." Harry frowned. It did make sense to fear werewolves when they transformed, but why did it matter the rest of the time? How did they find out? He asked. "Your father and Sirius were extremely clever," Lupin said in a wry tone of voice. "They figured out the pattern before long, and when they did, I fully expected them to abandon me, but instead they became animagi. My father was an animagus. Sirius is too." "Why?" Harry asked, leaning forward. "What were their forms?" Lupin smiled slightly. "Werewolves do not pose a significant danger to animals, and when they transformed, it was a good distraction to my wolf form." He folded his arms. "As for their forms, Sirius can transform into a dog, and your father was a stag." Harry tried to picture Sirius transforming into a dog. It wasn't as hard to imagine as one might think. "So that's why you didn't try to see me?" Harry asked, though not quite understanding why it would have mattered. "Because you're a werewolf." "In part," Lupin admitted. "While the friendships I had did a great deal of good for me, I still viewed myself as a danger that you were better off not being exposed to." "You said in part," said Harry. "So what was the other reason?" Lupin exhaled slowly. "When your parents were killed and Sirius carted off to Azkaban, I had lost everything. I was in a very dark place for a time, scarcely able to pull myself out of bed in the morning." Harry nodded, understanding dawning on him. "In my darkest moment," Lupin said in a near whisper, "I came very close to death and was admitted to a special ward in St. Mungo's for several months until it was determined that I was no longer a danger to myself." He closed his eyes briefly. "I know this is very difficult to comprehend why a person would feel the urge to take their own life, but it's not," Harry blurted out. "I'm sorry. It's not hard to understand." Harry very nearly regretted opening his mouth, but not enough to take back what he'd said. Lupin was staring at Harry very intently, but he did not seem about to speak, and Harry realized it was because the man was waiting for Harry to break the silence. Harry took a long, fortifying breath. I guess you know that before I lived with Severus, things were bad for me." "I gleaned as much," Lupin said, his face contorting slightly. "Well, at one point I was just feeling like nothing would ever, feel good again. So I tried to. Harry stopped talking, but it wasn't as though he needed to say anything more. Judging by the gasp Lupin let out, he understood what Harry was implying. "Please don't tell anyone," Harry said hoarsely. "Of course, Harry," he said, in a voice so sincere that Harry could not disbelieve him. "I assume Severus is aware." Harry nodded, pressing his lips together. "Have you been to see a professional?" Harry flushed, shaking his head slightly. I don't see the point. You may find it brings you a level of peace, even just to verbalize it with an impartial individual. Harry just shook his head again, gripping the edges of his chair. Lupin let out a sigh. You can go if you like, he said, though I truly hope you know that I'm available if you ever need to talk. Harry nodded at his lap and didn't look at Lupin as he gathered up his things to go. Later, though, the initial embarrassment and regret for opening his mouth faded away, in favor of another feeling that was difficult to identify at first. But he soon realized that it was nice to know that he wasn't the only one. Chapter 50, Soft Hands. Chapter text: There was an outbreak of owl's flu at Hogwarts. It wasn't actually a flu originating from owls, according to the chapter in the book Harry had found that discussed magical infectious diseases. It was just called that because this flu had once been believed to have spread via owls carrying post from one location to another. Modern magical medicine said otherwise, but the name had stuck. Outbreaks, when they did occur, tended to emerge in late winter, just before the turn of spring. It was marking, in its way, displacing the enjoyment of the slowly warming weather, spreading easily among the students in close quarters. All that aside, the symptoms didn't seem all that different from the regular muggle flu, save for one's skin taking on a noticeably grey tinge. Harry knew of at least 5 Ravenclaws who had caught it so far, and when he noticed Michael sniffling during breakfast, he might have spotted the 6th. You should probably get to the hospital wing before you infect us all, Terry advised, shifting away from Michael less than subtly. Michael scowled. It's not the flu. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, and Terry gave him a look. Long story short, it was the flu. We're all gonna die, Anthony said dramatically during lunch. Well, the girls are probably safe, but we sleep in the same room as him, breathe the same air. Have you never had the flu before? Padma interrupted. Don't think so. I never get sick. I had it once, Lisa said through a mouthful of grilled chicken. It was awful. Dad and I both got it a few years ago, Stephen added. If my grandmother hadn't come to help, we probably both would have starved to death. Can you get it again if you've had it before? Asked Morag, the one other muggle-raised student of the Ravenclaw first years. Well, not right away, said Lisa. According to the Wizarding Disease Control Center, the virus fully mutates every 2 or 3 years, so it's like a whole new disease by that point. Do people die from it? Rarely. It just spreads so fast that there's nothing to do but let it happen. The next several days proved Lisa's point. By all reports, the hospital wing was overcrowded, and Madame Pomfrey and Severus were working around the clock to prepare and administer the necessary potions. Severus still wanted Harry in his office every day, so Harry spent a good portion of each evening doing his homework in Severus' potions lab while the man brewed. All classes were invariably missing a few students, and several teachers had caught it as well. A number of students had taken to utilizing bubblehead charms during the day, but that trend ended quickly when Dumbledore announced one morning that the charm was not airtight enough to prevent transmission. The virus was clever, he'd said, and was resistant to most magical preventative measures. Though Michael had since recovered, Terry and Padma were out, as well as Padma's sister Parvati, whose parents had opted to bring home to recover. Hermione, Neville, and Ron seemed fine, but Seamus Finnegan was ill, too. Judging by the state of their potions classes, several Hufflepuffs had fallen ill, and the same could be said for the Slytherins during herbology. Zabini was all right, though, having had the flu just last year. If only ghosts could catch the flu, Sue muttered as they tried to stay awake through Bin's lecture. Harry snorted. Or we could just catch it ourselves to get out of class like everyone else. Harry's words proved to be prophetic, at least for him. He woke up in the middle of the night, unable to breathe through his nose, and a headache blooming at his temples. He managed to fall back asleep briefly, only to wake up again, his headache even worse. Harry, a distant voice was saying above his head, "You're going to be late for class." Harry moaned and blinked his eyes open, staring hazily at Anthony, whose brow was furrowing in concern. "Oh, it's got you as well," he said, frowning. Harry just groaned, pulling the covers over his head. Anthony, with the help of Sue, managed to haul Harry down to the common room, where they were stopped by Prefect Penelope Clearwater, who peered down at Harry with narrowed eyes. "I'll take him," she said. "I'm immune." "Get to class, you two." "Feel better, Harry," Anthony said with a pat on the shoulder. Sue squeezed his arm, and they both sort of faded from existence, from Harry's admittedly unreliable perspective at any rate. "Thank you, Miss Clearwater," Madame Pomfrey said tiredly when Penelope half-carried Harry into the hospital wing. "Run along now." Penelope left, and Madame Pomfrey led Harry to one of the few empty beds. "I'll be back in a moment." Harry sunk into the mattress, horribly dizzy, his head pounding sickeningly, and an awful nausea rising in his stomach. He pressed his hands over his ears at the grating sound of coughing and sniffling from the many ill patients. This was, officially, the worst. Harry must have fallen asleep at some point, because he awoke to the sound of a familiar voice. "Why was I not informed immediately?" Severus snapped. "Because I have over 30 ill students and staff members to look after," Madame Pomfrey shot back. "And those are just the ones who can't be cared for at home. I've already had to call in trainees from St. Mungo's to assist, and they won't arrive until tomorrow." "I'll take him off your hands then." "That's probably best. He'll be more comfortable in a private room." Harry blinked his eyes open as he was carefully lifted off the bed into Severus' arms. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, though he wasn't sure what for. "Hush." Though it was clear Severus was trying to be gentle, the trip down to Severus' quarters made Harry's head throb worse, and he thought he might vomit every time he was jostled a little too roughly. He pressed his face into Severus' shoulder and tried to breathe evenly. "We're nearly there," Severus murmured, resting his palm against the back of Harry's head. "I got ill," Harry slurred, because, for some reason, it felt like the thing to say. "Yes, you did." "It's a bird flu," he said, his tongue feeling thick in his mouth. "Well, strictly speaking, it is a wizard's flu." Harry lost track of what Severus was saying and kept his eyes closed until he was lowered into soft bedsheets and a bottle was pressed against his lips. "It's just water. You need to remain hydrated." Harry obediently opened his mouth and swallowed a few mouthfuls before turning his head away. "Thanks," he mumbled, curling onto his side. "Don't thank me. I wanna thank you." Harry didn't hear Severus reply because he was fast asleep. Something soft is brushing against his face. It feels a bit like feathers, and when he opens his eyes, they're greeted with the orange-red hue of a curtain of long hair. He reaches out with both arms, and he's pulled into the safest place in the world. It smells like flowers, and it feels like. The hair is a different color now, dark brown, and its texture rougher and more tangled. At least, it looks that way, because he's not touching it. It's a few feet away, framing an olive-toned face that's grinning mischievously at him. Jade's smile doesn't always reach her eyes, but it is now. The woody scent he's surrounded by reminds him of the flowery smell, not because it smells the same, but because it feels the same. Harry tried to squirm away from the hand on his shoulder that was shaking him awake. "Harry, you need to take this potion." Potion. "Yes, you require this potion." "Where's Jade?" "Who is Jade?" Harry's eyes filled with tears. "Jade's gone," he hiccuped. "She went away and Elle left me all alone." A soft hand smoothed over his cheek. It felt nice, not like the hard hands that slapped his cheek. He nuzzled against it. "Is Jade a friend of yours?" Harry sniffled. "Yeah, she's my only person. She's in the treehouse." No, that wasn't right. If she was in the treehouse, then she wouldn't be gone. "Treehouse," Severus murmured. "Might that be the treehouse I found you in when you had the grand idea of running off to Surrey on your own?" "It's a nice treehouse," said Harry, his lips turning up into a smile. "Jade found it first, and then I found her." Severus stroked his hair. "It is indeed a nice treehouse." "Your hand's soft," Harry said, lifting his arm to grab hold of it. It took 2 tries because his arm felt quite heavy. Severus let Harry hold his hand, which was just the nicest thing to do. "Lots of people's hands hurt," Harry stated, counting Severus' fingers to make sure he had all 5 of them. "Do they?" Severus asked. "Yes," Harry said decisively. "Uncle Vernon's hand is very mean." He shuddered, squeezing Severus' thumb. "It hurts a lot. Also Aunt Petunia's." Severus made a strange face that Harry didn't understand, but he could understand Severus cradling Harry's face in his 2 soft hands and saying, "No one will hurt you again," in a croaky, choked sort of voice. Harry reached over to touch Severus' face. "No one'll hurt you either." Neither of them could promise that, but it was nice to say. Severus took a long, deep breath, then took one of his hands away from Harry's face to pick up the bottle of magical potion again. "Will you drink this, please?" "'Kay." Harry swallowed the potion even though it tasted horrible because Severus had asked so nicely. The man then gave him more water, which helped clear away the taste. "Try to go back to sleep," Severus said, patting Harry's shoulder. Severus, words were better than any sleeping potion, because Harry fell asleep straight away. It was the dry coughs that woke Harry an indeterminate number of hours later. Harry clutched at his blankets as horrible, unrelenting coughs racked his body. When they subsided, he gasped for air, pressing a hand against his aching chest. The headache seemed to be mostly gone, as was the nausea, but the pain in his throat and chest was even worse. Harry took several careful breaths and fumbled clumsily for the half-filled bottle of water on his nightstand. The water helped soothe the dryness in his throat, but it didn't prevent the next bout of coughs, which were so rattling that the bottle slipped out of his hand. It didn't shatter when it hit the floor, but the remaining water spilled out of it. Feeling perilously close to tears, Harry turned onto his side, trying to suppress the next round of coughs. He was startled into releasing them, however, when Severus strode into the room. Harry's whole body shook with the force of the coughs, and Severus sat at the edge of the bed, pulling him upright and rubbing his back. Tears were streaming down Harry's face by that point, and he didn't even care how pathetic it made him look. "Hurts," he croaked when the coughing ebbed. "I know," Severus said quietly, still holding Harry upright. He pulled a vial out of his robes. "This won't prevent the coughing entirely, but it will reduce the frequency." Harry downed it in one gulp, desperate for a reprieve, and sighed in relief when the overwhelming urge to cough faded to a faint tickle in the back of his throat. "Aren't you going to get ill from me?" Harry asked hoarsely as Severus lowered him back into his pillows. "Do not concern yourself," Severus replied, leaning over to retrieve Harry's water bottle and refilling it with a flick of his wand. "I am concerned, though," Harry whispered, because it hurt less than using his voice. Severus set down the bottle and arranged Harry's blanket properly. "I contracted the illness within the past 3 years, so chances are slim that I will catch it from you." "Okay," Harry mumbled, blinking tiredly. Severus shifted as though he were going to stand, and Harry grabbed the man's wrist reflexively. Why had he done that? His face heated a little when Severus turned to look at him, exhaustion lining every inch of his face. But he couldn't bring himself to let go. "Can you?" Harry cleared his throat, wincing at the ache. "Yes," Severus asked, his voice low and whispery. Harry opened his mouth but could not bring himself to speak, to ask for the one thing he wanted more than anything in this moment. It was horrible, truly, how it was right there for him to take if only he could reach it, but it felt too far away. Severus would give it to him if he asked for it, but he just couldn't. Harry's eyes welled up with frustrated tears, and before he could let Severus see that, he pushed himself up carefully, his heart pounding with the exertion, and shifted himself closer to Severus. Before his brain could do anything more to stop him, Harry wrapped his arms around the man's neck. "Please," he mumbled into Severus' bony shoulder. "I just need please." And then Severus hugged him back. It felt so incredibly good that Harry's eyes welled over, his breaths growing short and shallow with the effort not to sob, because he really didn't want to right now. "Breathe, child," Severus murmured, still holding Harry tightly. Harry did his best to obey, but it felt rather superfluous. What did he need air for when he had this? Severus' throat felt strange. It was tight and achy, and his chest felt no better. His eyes were stinging, too, wetness pooling at the corners. Yet none of those symptoms were a sign of illness. They were a sign of the feverish child currently clinging to him and shivering due to the lack of temperature regulation that came with his illness, his overheated form radiating warmth. His child had wrapped his skinny little arms around him with a delirious desperation, his hitching breaths puffing against Severus' neck, and it made him want to weep. In sadness, pain, joy. Severus had not shed a tear in many years, and perhaps he had forgotten how. Yet if there was any one thing in the world that could draw them out, it would be this child. The fever seemed to have stripped Harry of his protective walls and his wariness, and it had allowed him to express his true desire. He just wanted to be held, and he wanted Severus to do it. And by all the gods, Severus would set fire upon the earth on his way to fulfill that need. And if pained, joyous, incredulous tears were now emerging in a darkened room in the dead of night, so be it. The next time Harry woke up, much of the fog of his illness seemed to have lifted. He still felt weak and achy, but a vague hunger was beginning to make itself known, not to mention a pressing need to use the facilities. Slowly, Harry slid off of his bed and to his feet, his hand brace against his nightstand for balance. He could probably make it to the door as long as he held onto something. and he did manage to make it out of his room, feeling along the wall on the way to the toilet. "What are you doing up?" Severus' voice startled Harry so that he nearly lost his footing, and Severus was there in a flash to catch him under the arms. "Need the loo," Harry mumbled, red-faced, squirming out of Severus' grip. He pulled open the door, then turned to stare up at Severus when the man made no move to retreat. "You're not coming in with me, are you?" he asked, half trepidatious, half mutinous. Just let Severus even try. "No," Severus said mildly. "I will be waiting outside the door in the event that you faint and crack your skull against the tub." Harry turned his head away, flushing, and entered the bathroom, closing the door behind him with a snap. He wasn't going to faint. He emerged shortly, still flushed, and Severus was right there waiting for him. "Back to bed, then." Harry shook his head rapidly. "No, I'm hungry." Severus studied him for a moment. "That's a good sign," he said, wrapping his arm around Harry's shoulders and leading him to the table. Moments later, a plate of buttered toast, a bowl of some sort of broth, and a steaming cup of tea popped into existence. Severus sat across from Harry with just a mug of black coffee. "Eat slowly," the man advised. "You may have more if you clear your plate." He pushed a glass of water in front of Harry. "I want you to finish this as well." Harry gave a tired salute that had Severus smirking into his coffee and tried not to devour his food too quickly. Surprisingly, he barely managed to finish one slice of toast and just a few spoonfuls of broth, along with the glass of water. He pushed his plate away and leaned back in his chair, the exhaustion starting to creep up on him again. "How are you feeling?" Severus asked. Harry's voice emerged as a croak, so he cleared his throat and tried again. "I'm all right, I think. Tired." "Everything aches." Severus nodded shortly. "That's to be expected. Headache? A bit." Severus waved his wand to summon a vial, which landed right next to Harry's plate. "That will clear your sinuses, which should ease the headache." Harry downed the potion in one swallow and exhaled in relief when his airways abruptly cleared, relieving the tightness in his forehead and temples and leaving a minty coolness behind. He closed his eyes for a few moments and just breathed, reveling in the absence of pain. A little while later, he managed to make a decent effort at his cup of tea while Severus sipped his coffee and flipped through a journal. "Who is Jade?" Severus asked abruptly, lifting his head. Harry nearly choked on his tea. How do you know about Jade? You mentioned that name to me at the height of your fever." Harry's face heated at the thought of what he might have said if he'd been in such a delirious state that he couldn't remember any of it. What did I say about her?" "You implied that she was a friend of yours who had left." Harry bit his lip, staring at the dregs of his tea. "She was," he said very quietly. "Did she pass away?" Severus asked in a careful tone. Harry jerked his head up. "No, she just moved away." "I see," said Severus. "Was she a friend from school?" Harry shook his head. "I dunno what school she went to. We met outside of school, not in my neighborhood. She lived on the side of town that Vernon used to say was populated by hooligans." Harry ended the sentence on a dry note. "Did she leave quite abruptly?" asked Severus. Harry stared. "How do you know? You stated that she had left you alone." Harry's shoulders hunched and he dropped his eyes towards his plate. "What is her surname?" Harry glanced up, confused at the question. I don't know. I don't think we ever mentioned our family names." Severus inclined his head. "Her age?" "Well, she was a year ahead of me at school, so she's probably 12 now. Or maybe 13. Wait, why are you asking?" "I thought I might make an attempt to track her down," said Severus. Harry blinked, then blinked again, finding himself unable to fully comprehend what Severus was suggesting. "Track her down? I've never even thought. Why have I never thought to try?" Probably because he'd grown used to the loss, having accepted the ache of her absence just as surely as he'd accepted his parents' deaths. They would never come back, and neither would Jade. But why not? She wasn't dead. He hadn't had the resources to find her back then, but he had a whole magical world at his fingertips now. Harry refocused his gaze upon Severus, who was looking back at him with a faintly concerned expression on his face. Harry broke off, taking a careful breath. If you can find her, he gave up then, swallowing against the rising lump in his throat. Severus gave him a brief, tired smile, reaching across the table to refill Harry's water glass. He lowered the jug, his hand lingering upon it for a moment, then released it to press his palm against Harry's forehead. The warmth it left behind was no longer a sign of fever.